Hello. Hello everybody. I hope everyone can hear me today. That would be a good way to start this particular episode of the Drydock. Alright, hello. People seem to be able to see me. So, yeah, that's good. Rightio. Excellent. So, as you can see from the background, this episode is not coming live from Tankfest, where everything's working on Wi-Fi and my rather horrific transmission capabilities on my laptop, and that's my phone, so I'm going to turn that to silent. I'd forgotten to do that. Of course, everybody is now deciding it's time to message me, so I will put it on Do Not Disturb. Ta-da. Right. Thank you, Fushi Smith. The laptop is pretty good for writing. It's actually relatively decent for editing and video work. The one thing it's really not good at is streaming, as I'm sure you all experienced. So, as most of you will hopefully know, and those of you who have joining for the first time, I will briefly explain. The format of the end of the month dry docks, and yes, technically it's the end of the month, at least in my book, because most of this week was September, is that I cover alternate history and other similar Patreon questions from the Patreon questions for the month. The long recorded dry dock that will go live on Sunday is also part of that, but basically it's split into two. So the sort of full-on historical questions go in that one, and the ones that are either partly historical or alternate history, etc., go in this one. And then once all of that is done, then we take questions from the chat, and that's slightly different to the format of the mid-month live streams, which is where questions are taken directly from the chat straight off. So let's get on with that. Starting off with the Patreon questions. Chaingun 101 asks, if USS Texas was brought into service in early April 1912 and her first assignment was a show the flag mission into Europe, and Texas' newly built wireless set suffers a malfunction on the fateful night of April 16th, 1912 and can't transmit, while it can still transmit, Texas can't receive any wireless signals. Around 22:30 hours, she sights RMS Titanic, and then at 23:40 hours, lookouts report Titanic appears to have stopped. At 00:45 hours, 5 rockets are seen above the Titanic. Would the Texas investigate? Assuming that she starts from the same distance as Californian was at historically, could she have arrived in time to be of help? Assuming that she did, how would she have gone about rendering assistance? How many could she have saved? And where on the battleship would they have potentially put up to 3,000 unexpected guests? So basically, it's what if Texas took the place of Californian that night? The short answer is yes, Texas almost certainly would have assisted. The reason for that is that it's a warship. It has to stand watch 24/7, as opposed to something like Californian, where people can just effectively semi-shut down the ship and wait overnight if they feel they have to, such as in ice flows. So it's much more likely she'd have A, more, and B, more competent people standing watch, and when they see distress signals going up, which they'd recognise the rockets as, even if their wireless set can't receive any messages, they're going to go and investigate. It is one of the main things that warships would do when they're at sea in peacetime. So there's every chance that she would pile on the speed. Now, in terms of when she'd get there and how much assistance that would actually be, she is closer than Carpathia, and we'll come to Carpathia later on in the stream. but because there's another question about that. But she is a bit slower than the average liner. Nonetheless, she is almost certainly going to beat Carpathia there. She's only 3-4 knots slower than the cruise liners that are, or ocean liners that are around at the time. So she would have arrived somewhat before Carpathia did, which, depending on the mathematics, she might get there before Titanic sinks. She might get there just after it sinks, but either way, there's going to be a lot more people in the water. How she would have rendered assistance? Almost certainly it would have been a case of the ship's boats being put out with members of the crew aboard to rescue survivors in the water. They would be brought aboard first, and then, where possible, the davits would be used to haul up Titanic's boats if the systems matched, and if they didn't, then they would either transfer people into Texas's boats and then haul the boats up, so the boats would be going up and down a few times. Alternatively, they could put rope ladders and nets over the side, the way you would rescue survivors at sea in wartime. But obviously at the same time, if you've got women and children, which that makes up the majority of those in the boats, plus there's maybe some older people as well, they're probably not going to be in the best of conditions after a few hours in the North Atlantic to be hauling themselves up those. So I suspect it would be a case of, those that can come up the rope nets, which would make the job of transferring people into Texas's boats and then hauling those up considerably easier. So as a result, there would be a lot more people saved, particularly, I suspect, the people who were in the water once the ship went down, because those who were in the boats mostly survived for as long as it took to pick them up. As for where on the battleship you'd put several hundred unexpected guests, pretty much anywhere. Battleships do tend to have a reasonable amount of space. They're not liners, obviously, but there's a lot of spaces, even places like the mess room decks and such, like, where you can put people. And to be honest, the survivors who have come up from the boats, as opposed to in the water, can probably just sit around the decks for the minute until they sort something out. Once Carpathia shows up, obviously they can then share the load. So that's Chaingun 1701's question. Sorry, just copying a couple of bits over. Firemind asks, did warships ever mistake small islands or rocks for enemy ships and open fire on them? And did warships ever lose the engagement with a hostile landmass? It happened relatively rarely, but it did happen. In the early days of radar, there were even cases of people bombarding stretches of open ocean just because they had a funny radar return. Usually it would be either just a particularly unusual wave formation or potentially a flock of seabirds that had gathered in large numbers or something like that. But engaging actual islands and rocks, thinking that they are the enemy, yes, there are cases of that happening throughout history. It tends to happen more in the age of sail rather than in the steam and steel age, although there's a few instances there, but largely predicated on the fact that charts and navigation tend to get better and more accurate. So when you spot something large and unmoving in the darkness, by the late 19th, early 20th century, assuming that you've got decent charts of the area, it's not too difficult to tell that may well be a rocky outcropping or something, whereas back in the age of sail, no one might have charts of the area that are good enough, and even if there are people who do, you may not be part of the navy that does, and if you are part of the navy that does, you may not be the particular ship that has been issued with those charts. In terms of warships ever losing engagements with hostile landmasses, off the top of my head I can think of at least 2 Age of Sail vessels that engaged rocks thinking they were unfriendly ships, and then because they were so obsessed with stopping the enemy vessel, they ended up going aground, not necessarily on that rock itself, but perhaps on nearby rocks and shoals that were around. Because you can get the odd sort of lone rock, but usually where there's one lump of rock sticking up above the ocean, there's usually about half a dozen that are just below the waterline and waiting to rip you open. Jellicoe Cats Get Confused at Night asks, if in September 1914 USS Duncan DD-46 is heading up the Chesapeake toward Baltimore, as it enters a strange fog bank, it pops out of the time-travelling fog bank 100 years back in time. The captain, having read H.G. Wells, realises what's happened, orders the crew to battle stations, and they come up behind a small fleet of British sailing ships bombarding Fort McHenry. How does the engagement go? Even with 5 to 10 or 10 to 1 odds, do the British ships stand a chance against a single ship from 100 years in the future in the narrow confines of the Chesapeake? Almost certainly not. The fundamental problem with any kind of time travel event that involves having a warship of the 20th century head back in time to the Age of Sail is simply the fact that once you get past 1903, 1904-ish, the battle ranges of pretty much any ship up to and sort of down to, I guess, and including destroyers, have extended well beyond the effective engagement range of an Age of Sail warship. And a modern warship, even a relatively slow one like a pre-dreadnought battleship, let alone a destroyer, is significantly faster. So not only has it got the range, it can maintain the range. Now, granted, a 1914 era US destroyer is only going to have a handful of 4-inch guns present, so it will take a while, but the main threat for USS Duncan at that point is whether or not she can kill all of the sailing warships before she runs out of ammunition. There's not really any other option at that point. She'll have some torpedoes as well. They'll probably do a fairly decent number if they can get them to hit, but effectively you're looking at a situation where it's the destroyer's battle to lose, with the only way it could possibly lose being either if it's just dumb enough it gets too close that cannon fire, whilst probably not messing up the vitals, could potentially mess up the bridge and the open gun crews, I say, if it's dumb enough to get within a few hundred yards, or it just runs out of ammo and therefore technically can't complete the battle and just has to wander off somewhere else. Cracked Cactus asks, tanks these days have interesting armor schemes with things like Dorchester armor. Could a modern battleship use this effectively as an armor scheme, and what would the protection likely scale to? Would depleted uranium work better than hardened steel, or would laminated armor make a comeback? No, is the short answer. Whilst I have on bilge pumps and a few other places mentioned that there may be a potential for a quote-unquote battleship-like system to come back, i.e. a ship armed with very big guns, the idea of a battleship as a heavily armoured platform relying on that armour for its defence, I don't see coming back with anything like what we've got in terms of modern technology at the moment. The reason for that is, one, as if you look at any battleship that's built in World War II, World War I, you're talking about taking up anything from 20 to 30% of the ship's displacement just with a dead weight of armour. Possibly slightly less for battle cruisers, possibly slightly more in the case of some hilariously inefficiently designed ships. But that's a lot of weight, and that's a lot of weight that these days could be going into more active defensive systems, missile launchers, guns, etc., etc. And that's going to be a much better defense than armor, and this is kind of the crux of the matter. I know I don't go into modern politics and ship design, but this is basically the issue why the battleship was, apart from the range issues, the reason why battleships and armoured vessels in general kind of died away in the late 40s and early 1950s. And it's simply the fact that it is possible to make a projectile, whether that be a guided bomb or a missile, big enough, with a large enough and nasty enough warhead, and going fast enough to negate pretty much any realistic amount of armour from any realistic material that you can possibly install on a battleship. And therefore, you know, even if you build a battleship that somehow is immune to this generation of missiles, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to build another even bigger, even nastier missile than it is to build another generation of even more heavily armoured battleships. So the missile, assuming that it hits, will always win. And that means that heavily armouring large portions of your ship is basically a non-starter. Plus, of course, the fact that these days there's bits of the ship you can't armour, like the radar and communication systems, and all you have to do is basically fragment kill those, and the ship's effectively useless anyway, because if you kill the comms, you've also killed any possibility of data links. So it's just not worth it. Now, granted, it would force the enemy to use fewer larger missiles than multiple smaller ones that on an unarmoured ship or only lightly armoured ship might do the same job, which you might argue then, oh, well, the defences can possibly pick up the slack if the individual targets are fewer, but those individual targets then going to be tougher, possibly have their own countermeasure defences, and because you've devoted so much displacement to your armour, you won't have as many defensive systems on board anyway. And unlike tank versus tank battles, where you're talking about maybe 120mm gun on average, maybe slightly larger calibers on some tanks these days, you can fire a missile the size of a bus at somebody. They're not coming back from that. And just a FYI for everybody, the goblet is currently being cleaned, so today the Iron Brew, it comes courtesy of this rather nice reusable cinema drinks cup that I got when I was at Tankfest. Hart Heffelfinger asks, it is often said that naval captains are the last true dictators in democratic or industrialized societies, and even today their ability to punish those under them is oftentimes unilateral and sometimes severe. Contemporarily, too much martial enthusiasm would likely lead to a short captaincy. Are there any historical examples of particularly severe or brutal captains, perhaps allowed to continue to serve because of either nepotism or real naval ability? And if so, do any come to mind? There's a lot of bad captains who were allowed to stay in command because at the time the admiralty of whatever nation didn't particularly care about the plight of the men, and quite often that could lead to revolts. I mean, the Brazilian Navy, after it got its Minas Gerais class dreadnoughts, had what I think was called the Revolt of the Lash, because, well, clues in the name, they weren't exactly being particularly nicely treated. So there's that kind of thing. I mean, it very much depends on the Navy and the culture of the time. So even if you take the Royal Navy, for example, there were cases, maybe in the, a good time would be, say, the early 17th century, where people were in command of ships, and sometimes the captains could be incredibly brutal, but they knew the right people, either in the Admiralty or in court, or they got results, and so people just ignored it until things came back to bite them. As you ended up in kind of the eternal war scenario of the mid-1700s through to the early 1800s, meritocracy started to take a little bit more of an uptick, but there were still some fairly harsh captains during that period. And to be honest, actually, one of the funniest things about, you know, with the fact that captain is effectively God on his ship is the fact that that largely was established back in the 1500s by Sir Francis Drake, who, for all his many naval capabilities and the fact that he had a lot of favour at court, was not exactly the nicest person to work for by all accounts. Basically, up until the this point, on the start of his round-the-world voyage, captains, at least aboard English vessels, were somewhat subject to their crews. Their crews could express some concerns and get them, to change their ways or potentially be removed, potentially violently, from command. And there was also social hierarchy to consider. And this was one of the issues that flared up near the start of Drake's Round the World voyage, of whether just because somebody else who was aboard was a gentleman, and Drake at the time was not, did this mean that that person had an equal or greater say in the command of the expedition, regardless of the fact that Drake was notionally supposed to be in command of the expedition, and of course did actually have far more sea-going capability and experience. There's a lot to be said about that whole incident, but the long and the short of it is eventually Drake got so fed up, he put the guy ashore, charged him with treason, he intimidated everybody else into passing sentence, and executed the guy. And he effectively turned around and said, right, who's next who wants to challenge me? And shockingly enough, not too many people wanted to after that particular show. And following that, the tradition of, the captain's word is law gradually filtered into English mariners, and from them through to everybody else. Phil Kreider asks, there's some personal information, so I won't read that bit out, but he mentions that a person who was leaving their job was given a Bravo Zulu. When did the Royal Navy use Bravo Zulu before the NATO code was adopted, and when and where did it originate? I have a book on historical signals in the Royal Navy that does actually cover this, but yes, Bravo Zulu as a specific signal of congratulations does predate the NATO code being adopted, and was used across a number of navies, including the Royal Navy. Exactly when and where, I shall have to get back to you on, but there's a short answer for the minute. Richard Scrabble, or Scrable possibly, asks, can we get Mrs. Drac to do a ship review video? Perhaps her favourite ship. Possibly. I don't know. She's currently playing something, so I'm not going to disturb her because I value my limbs. But I will ask her, and if she's willing, perhaps that can be a special thing. Although I rather doubt she'll want to do it in C-mine voice the entire time. I don't know, well, can't hurt to ask. Well, it can hurt me to ask. It might not hurt you guys, because you're not here, but I shall take whether or not I ask her to do it in C-mine voice under advisement. SMS Schleswig-Holstein asks, if the US Navy, and Imperial Japanese Navy and Royal Navy had been allowed to complete their post-World War I building programs, including the 1916 Navy Act, after the Washington Naval Treaty, assuming they've got everything expanded to allow that, how would this change the interwar building programs and development of tactics for the interwar period? And how would this change the naval part of the Second World War? That is actually quite an interesting one, because if we take it strictly literally, i.e. the Lexingtons, the South Dakotas, N3G3s, Tosas, Amagis, and possibly the Keys are built, but even if it's just the Tosas and the Amagis, that is going to change quite a few things. For one thing, assuming that obviously they're still signing some kind of treaty, the major powers are probably going to use that as an excuse to ditch the last of their dreadnoughts and first-gen super dreadnoughts. So the US won't have Wyoming, Utah, Arkansas, etc. They'll probably ditch all of those, and the kind of Utah, Wyoming-style training battleship role will probably be taken over by New York and Texas, because then that gives the US a battle line that consists solely of pure standard-type battleships. Because the South Dakotas effectively are just I mean, they're a little bit quicker than the average standard, but they are very much the tail end of the standard-type designs. The Japanese, it'll be an interesting one whether they ditch the Congos which are technically the oldest ships they otherwise would want to keep, or the Fusos and Iseis, which they may see as somewhat less capable considering their relatively slower speed. I don't know what the Japanese would actually do there, to be perfectly honest. They might try and keep everything, which would be an interesting pull on their economy. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, that is possibly the most likely thing. They try and keep all the 14 and the 16-inch ships. So yeah, the British, if they get the G3s and the N3s, then all the 13.5-inch ships are gone very quickly. They might keep Tiger around for a bit as a training ship, but the King George V's and the Iron Dukes will be out of service basically as the G3s and N3s come into service. Now, the interesting thing about tactics is that it actually puts the Royal Navy at a slight advantage, not so much in the battle line, but because they don't want the Courageous class anyway at this point. So they're going to be probably almost certainly converting Courageous, Glorious, and Furious, whatever happens. If the Japanese and the Americans have been allowed to complete the Lexingtons and the Amagis, then by inference those Lexingtons and Amagis are not going to be turned into carriers, which means that the US will have Langley. Maybe at some point later in the 1920s they'll get something like Ranger. The Japanese will get Hosho, and they'll presumably have to also move into the idea of coming up with their own purpose-built carriers as well. So you're going to end up in this slightly odd situation wherein once you get into the 1930s, the Japanese and American carrier fleets are going to almost certainly, outside of Langley and Hosho, consist entirely of purpose-built carriers. But some of those early purpose-built carriers might be relatively slow, they might be relatively small, they might be not particularly valuable by the time World War II comes around, and all the experience that was built up in the late 1920s and early 30s of carrier operations by those two navies won't have happened. Whereas the British will have Courageous, Glorious, Furious, Hermes, Eagle, and Argus floating around, so they will have had most of the 1920s getting quite a bit of carrier experience. Of course, whether or not that's actually going to do them much good in the long term, with the RAF in control of the Fleet Air Arm for most of the 1920s and 30s, is another matter, but they'll at least have an idea of how they're going to be using those ships. Taratata asks, it's a Kitbash, my pick. So yeah, basically Taratata is asking me to kitbash together my ideal battleship from all sorts of World War II battleship bits and pieces. So quite a while ago I did this. There's actually a 3D model of HMS Drac floating around somewhere that somebody sent me. I shall have to try and dig that up and put some screen caps up on the next recorded Drydock at the end of next week. Graham William Kidd asked me to give my thoughts on the book HMS Ulysses. Unfortunately, I haven't actually read that book in a long time. I think I read it when I was in my early teens. So, to be honest, I don't recall a tremendous amount of it. I think I was skim reading it. So, it's going to have to be something I'm probably going to have to try and pick up maybe in the next couple of months when I've got a little bit of spare time, albeit that the next couple of weeks are looking very busy. So yeah, unfortunately, whilst I would love to give you a detailed breakdown to answer your questions, sort of what's the ship, how accurate is the portrayals, etc., I simply am not in a place to do that at the moment. Yeah. Silverfox575, have you ever played the board game Axis versus Allies? I have not. I've seen it in a couple of game shops, but I don't think I've ever played it. Whiskey Delta Golf, alternate history. The Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf and the German fleet at Jutland swapped places, including all escorts and accompanying ships. First scouting group swaps places with the Northern Force. Second battle squadron swaps with the Southern Force. And the main force of the High Seas Fleet swaps with the Centre Force. To minimise butterflies, we'll assume the swap happens for the High Seas Fleet the moment they sight the smoke from the NJ Fjord, and for the Japanese just before battle is joined at Surigao Strait. Japanese and German officers recognise the British and Americans respectively as their enemy and have the same motivation to fight as their real-world counterparts. How do the two fleets fare in their new respective engagements? Okay, so first scouting group in the place of the Northern Force is pretty much dead. They have no AA to speak of. They've got Halsey's carriers coming after them, who are going to be slightly confused to find a bunch of German battle cruisers in the place of where they're expecting Japanese carriers, but you know what, never mind. And yeah, so they're, for all the toughness of the German ships, they're going to get sunk in very short order. Second battle squadron swapping with the Southern Force is pretty much in the same predicament. Yes, there's slightly more of them than the Japanese had in the Surigao Strait, and yes, they do have night fighting capability as well, but they've got limited range and they're up against a bunch of American battleships with radar, a number of which are hull-wise in the future as far as they're concerned, and even the ones that aren't are significantly upgraded, so the fight will take a little bit longer. Perhaps the American battleships might run out of armor-piercing ammunition, dealing with just the fact there's just more battleships and potentially some torpedo boat escorts. But there's plenty of cruisers and destroyers out there with radar and torpedoes who can make short work of that. The rest of the High Seas Fleet barreling down the centre is a slightly different matter. They are slower than the Japanese, so it's going to take more time. But there's just so many of them. You're talking well over 100 ships, including cruisers and destroyers, that, to be honest, I can't see the Taffies will, once they get their planes together and start dropping torpedoes and bombs, etc., will do a lot of damage, because, again, practically no anti-aircraft fire. But there's just so many. They're going to get into the... they're almost certainly just going to get into the landing areas, even if they take quite horrific losses, with a fairly substantial amount of shipping, and do a fair bit of damage just through sheer weight of numbers. Effectively, you can't sink enough of them fast enough before they get there. The interesting thing, of course, being that some of the German torpedo boats that were present at Jutland are so small that... assuming that they don't get land a torpedo hit relatively soon, a fair number of the transports and other landing craft that have their own 3 and 4 inch and 5 inch gun armaments might actually be able to give them a relatively decent straight fight in a gun battle, but still, there's just a lot of ships and a lot of guns coming in your way. If you combine the Northern, Southern and Centre forces at the Battle of Jutland, on the other hand, and you talk about the time they sight smoke from NJ Fjord, the Japanese hold a lot of the cards. Their cruisers are better, their destroyers are better, their battleships, needless to say, are all better. Even Fuso, which is a little bit worn out at that point, simply because they have more advanced fire control systems and obviously bigger guns, etc. The only way that the Japanese don't inflict a lot of casualties before waltzing away is if they get close enough for the British guns to get range on them and open fire, because kind of an inverse of what's happening at for the swap with the Centre Force, there's a lot of British ships. Even the combined forces present for the Battle of Leyte Gulf from the Japanese don't add up to the numbers that the Germans had. So as long as they can keep the range, they're fine, but if for whatever reason they get a little bit stymied by what's going on and they end up sub 20,000 yards, there's an awful lot of 12-inch, 13.5 inch and 15-inch shells coming in. Kyla Stern asks, if the naval arms race isn't stopped by treaties, and then obviously that's going to lead to the Japanese dropping out at some point, if the US nor the UK are actually willing to go to war, what are they going to do once their ships hit 18-inch guns? You said 20 inches aren't really viable, but since they won't stop, what are they going to do? They'll probably build a few 20-inch gunships, and then it'll become clear that it's not really a good idea, at which point you've got two more paths to follow, because you take the N3 as your baseline. Let's say you've got 9 18-inch guns, so your two paths of upgrade at that point are add in a fourth turret, so you have 12 guns, which will need a bigger ship, and also start to work on speed. So I suspect everything will settle down relatively quickly. There'll be 18-inch gunships with 8 or 9 guns. There'll be a few experimental vessels with 20-inch guns. They'll think that's stupid. We're going to go back to, imagine for the Americans, like a South Dakota, but with 18-inch guns. And then as people start thinking, well, there's not a tremendous amount more we can do with the firepower, the armor hopefully is somewhat capable of dealing with the incoming shells at some kind of range. So once they've established that, further technological development's probably going to be along the lines of when newer, more powerful, more compact boilers, etc. come in, you'll be looking at the battleships gradually upping their speed to become fast battleships, possibly ditching a turret so that they become 9 18-inch gunships capable of 27, 28 knots, i.e. something along the lines of maybe a slightly bigger than Yamato style ship is probably going to become the standard. Bill Cunningham asks, the father of Alexander Winton, one of the leading pioneers in the early automotive world, was a marine engineer from Scotland, also named Alexander. If the son is anything like his father, I would imagine Daddy Winton would have been quite the naval engineer in the mid-19th century, either for the Royal Navy or Merchant Marine. However, I can't find much of anything about his career. Might you have any insights? I found two contradictory sets of information. The problem is, as you might expect, the younger Alexander Winton dominates pretty much all search results and literature because of his much more famous career designing motor vehicles. And when it comes to his father, there's one line of sources that say his father was a blacksmith and taught his son marine engineering. There's another line that says he was a marine engineer. Not entirely sure which of the two is the most accurate, but the information is pretty scarce. It's usually sort of half a paragraph in passing in an article about the younger Winton. Now, I may have some leads on, because you mentioned he's from Scotland, so there is some stuff in the National Archives which might help on that. But I need to actually get to the National Archives to look those up, which I haven't been able to do in the sort of couple of weeks since I picked up the question. So I will keep trying and see what I can find. But, you know, we'll just have to see what comes up. Xeroth. Suppose through cooperation with the Kriegsmarine and prioritization of sonar and related technologies, the Japanese successfully integrate an acoustic homing system of reasonable quality into the Type 93 torpedo and its variants fleet-wide by 1941. How would this change the course of the war above and below the surface, assuming that Japanese submarine forces adopt Kriegsmarine submarine tactics? If the Type 91 could be fitted with this system, what would its effects be? So if you've got an acoustic homing Type 93, things, well, they get a lot more dicey early on, because if you think, well, the Battle of the Java Sea couldn't have gone that much worse for ABDA Command, but theoretically it could have done, and Japanese could have saved themselves a lot of torpedoes. So you'd be looking for you'd be looking at the ABDA Command battles going horribly badly, like almost total losses, basically, for the Allies. And then when you look at some of the other battles later on, in, say, the Guadalcanal campaign, Coral Sea Midway, etc., those also obviously are going to get very bad, because the Japanese did fire an awful lot of torpedoes at US and Allied ships, the vast majority of which didn't hit. If now they have a pretty decent chance of hitting because of their acoustic homing devices, they could wipe Allied presence off of the Western Pacific pretty darn quickly, assuming the Allies don't realise what's happening and come up with some kind of direct countermeasure pretty sharpish. If they can integrate it into the airborne torpedoes, then Coral Sea and Midway get a lot worse as well, because there were a lot of aerial torpedoes dropped. Not that many hit, but you really don't want to be on the receiving end if, the thing is, if a bunch of Japanese torpedo bombers drop their torpedoes and you evade and you shoot down 2/3 of them, that's a bad trade for the Japanese. They haven't accomplished anything. They've lost a bunch of valuable aircraft and even more valuable pilots. If the Japanese send in those same 12 aircraft with acoustic homing torpedoes and you shoot down 2/3 of them, but they hit you with 2 or 3 of their homing torpedoes and cripple you, they'll happily trade at that level all day, every day. Captain Lorenzo asks, 2 or even 3 Japanese Takao class heavy cruisers versus an updated HMS Renown. What is the outcome? So, modernized HMS Renown. 2 cruisers versus HMS Renown. Renown will almost certainly win. The speed difference isn't enough to let them close down the Renown, and the kind of slow pace of that closing, Renown's gunnery is more than enough to put them down. It's not exactly like the Takaos are particularly well protected and basically have non-existent protection when it comes to 15-inch shells. The weakness there might be that Renown might be tempted to chase them, at which point they can dump long lances in the water, which obviously if they contact Renown, that could be a rather major problem. 3 Takaos is a bit more of an interesting one. It's unlikely Renown would try a close chase of 3 heavy cruisers, which kind of obviates the danger from having torps dumped into the water ahead of her. On the other hand, there's no way that Renown can keep up either split fire against 3 cruisers, nor is it likely, to be honest, that she can put down the first cruiser quickly enough to deal with the second and the third before 8-inch shells start ranging on her. Again, assuming the Japanese can get the range. So it kind of it evens out in that one of the major dangers to Renown of top fighting 2 is removed, but the overall danger increases. So in that case, it's going to depend a lot more on the environmental factors. Can Renown run freely in the open sea to try and engage and knock out a cruiser or 2 at a time, rather than having to fight all 3 at a time? If it's an enclosed space where she can't do that, she doesn't have freedom to maneuver, the Japanese can use their torpedoes to better effect. And also, even simple things like, what's the weather? Because if Renown's using her fire control radar that she'd have late in the war, then foggy weather, stormy weather, and night weather, she'll quite happily take it, because she can waltz up, blast away at a cow and be onto her second target before they realise what's going on. Whereas if it's bright daylight, it becomes a lot more difficult. Dr. Irrelevant asks, if you were in charge of post-World War II reductions to the Royal Navy, what would you have done differently? What ships would you have scrapped sooner, kept in service longer, preserved, completed, or sold on to other nations, for example, selling Renown to Turkey or the Netherlands? And what about preserving the guns and turrets from Queen Elizabeth and Valiant to build additional vanguards? Well, as I've mentioned before when talking about the Malta-class carriers, I'd have a radically different post-World War II plan for aircraft carriers that involves building 4 Maltas, keeping 4 Bulwark-Centaur class around, and the 2 maybe the 2 Audaciouses, and scrapping literally everything else. If allies are interested in buying some of my older capital ships, then sure, I'll go for that. Building additional vanguards, much as I'd love to, probably is not going to be on the cards at this point, because battleship construction is pretty much over. But in terms of keeping ships in service longer, preserved, etc. I mean, obviously, I'm going to campaign to try and keep Warspite intact long enough for people to take interest in her and use and turn her into a museum ship. So, yes, she's completely battered and broken at this point, but I could probably do something similar to, the traditional thing that is done with battered and broken Royal Navy ships. Turn her into a barracks or accommodation vessel for a while, and hope she lasts in that role long enough for people, as I say, later on to take an interest in preserving her. Most of the other capital ships are fairly worn out. Obviously, keep Vanguard around. Keep the King George V in reserve. I mean, the thing is that there is such a financial pressure. I'd be really tempted to see what would happen with Nelson's proposed modernisation, but I just do not think I'd be allowed to afford it. There's various cruiser proposals I might like to follow through with. I don't think the Neptunes, and that is literally what the project was called, the Neptune class, i.e., yes, the Tier 9 World of Warships cruiser, and the Minotaur, again, yes, actually class name, and yes, that design, the Tier 10 World of Warships cruiser. I'd like to get some of those built, certainly some Minotaurs. I think they'd do a lot better off than building the Tigers. And the main thing is with that time period is there's so much prevarication that ends up costing a lot of money. So I would just say, scrap what would eventually become the Tigers, identify my worn out town class cruisers, get rid of those, drop the Leanders and the Arethusas pretty quickly, basically slim down my cruiser force, perhaps even some of the more battered counties, to a point where I can justify financially and numbers-wise building a few Minotaurs. Because, one, that would be quite amusing, and two, they'd actually make pretty good command ships, command and control vessels, etc., and escort vessels for later on. Destroyers-wise, again, it's mostly with things like the Darings, it's just a case of cutting through the bureaucracy and the red tape and the prevarication, just going, no, we're doing this, end of. Maybe you have to delay a few things while the merchant fleet is built back up, but I would streamline and modernise the Royal Navy. So instead of operating about 400 different classes in the 1950s, you basically cut out anything that's worn out, anything that's battered, anything that's really too small, puts a leavening of new ships in all the classes, with the exception, obviously, of battleships, apart from Vanguard, and accept that, yes, I might have a slightly smaller navy than I could otherwise have had, but those ships are going to be infinitely more capable. IO2 pointing out, yeah, the Minotaurs later turn into missile cruisers. Would be entirely possible. And the thing is, because of their layout with 3-gun turrets forward and 2 aft, they lend themselves very well to potentially allocating the aft section to become either a missile farm or a helicopter landing pad or whatever, whilst retaining just enough firepower forward for their gun side of things. And Knight 6831, yeah, it's too costly to preserve Warspite as a museum ship right there and then, but as I say, this is why I would just park it up in Devonport or somewhere and say, right, this is no longer HMS Warspite, this is, HMS insert name of stone frigate here, it is now an accommodation and barrack ship, because then we're not having to pay the costs of preserving her, we're getting some functional use out of her, it means we can get rid of an older hulk, and it's just a sort of sneaky backdoors way of keeping her around at minimal cost until such time as somebody decides, actually, maybe we should, repair her. Jeffrey Connolly asks, if the Prince Eugen had been retained by the US Navy and had her entire propulsion system and other machinery along with all her weapons except the 8-inch guns taken out, how long would it take to complete such a procedure, and what do you believe the US Navy would have put in to replace all her weaponry? Basically they wouldn't, because to strip out all of Prince Eugen's weapons, bar the 8-inch guns, and completely replace her machinery, basically means you're pulling the ship apart down to almost the keel and effectively rebuilding it, which at that point you might as well just build another Des Moines or an Oregon City or anything other than having this odd one-off floating around, because even her size and displacement aren't particularly novel features by the end of World War II. You know, the Baltimores are there, apart from anything else. If for whatever bizarre reason they did decide to do it, it would actually probably take longer than building a brand new ship, because they'd have to take off all the non-8-inch guns. They'd then, as I say, have to strip her down, get right down into the interior to remove all the machinery, and then they can get on with replacing the machinery. So they've actually got to deconstruct the ship and then rebuild it again, plus trying to work out how to hybridize all the systems. You're probably talking about a 5-year process at that point. Terrafel asks, I think a while ago you answered some questions about the anchor turn in the movie Battleship. Yes, for my sins, I did. I did actually answer those at that question. So, going on from that, and you're saying that the anchor turn would just rip out the anchor or the chain right off the ship. Yeah, or the chain would just run out, because it's not actually fixed on. What would happen if it didn't just break? I don't believe Missouri was ever intended to be sailed sideways. Basically, it depends. Oh, and he also asked, would I plan to visit USS Silversides? Probably on US Tour Mark II, which I now have sketch outlines of 3 different US tours going on. But anyway, getting back to the main question. If you've got an unobtainium chain that's not going to break when somebody tries to pull it off, basically one of 3 things is going to happen. Either, if you're lucky, the anchor will bite and the chain will just keep running out, and then it'll run out and the ship will continue on, because, as I say, most anchor chains are not actually secured at the other end. Option 2, it bites, it then acts like razor wire and cuts through the bow of the ship. As the ship's momentum carries on, the ship warps slightly in the direction that it was they intended it to turn, and they have to put up with the fact they basically probably neatly sliced their own bow off and are now sinking quite quickly. Or option 3, if for some bizarre reason, I don't know, maybe the initial forward part of the ship has also now been made of unobtainium, so that it won't just slice, you probably just rip the front of the ship off, or at least severely mangle and warp the structure, because you're effectively talking about a sort of 45,000, probably, I mean, it's a museum ship, so 45,000 ton, maybe up to 50,000 ton or more object moving at the better part of 40 miles an hour, if she's going at full speed, probably a bit faster, and then being yanked to a sudden stop. I mean, you know, okay, look at a car that hits a brick wall at 45 miles an hour. You might think that's unfair because cars have crumple zones and aren't armoured like battleships. Well, spoiler alert, neither's the bow of a battleship. It's just gonna... It's just... Yeah, it's not going to be a good thing, whatever happens at that point. I mean, the Iowas are strong, but they're not, you know, clothesline themselves with an unobtainium chain strong. Brian Roper, what naval officer depicted in film was the least accurate portrayal based on contemporary sources? I'm thinking Fletcher in the 1976 Midway movie, but would like to hear what you have to offer. See, the thing is, I haven't actually watched that many fictional naval films, and a lot of the ones that I have watched are the ones that are fairly critically acclaimed for being pretty darn good, and so obviously their portrayals are fairly good. Off the top of my head, of recent movies that I've watched, the 2 least accurate would probably actually come from the last 2 fictional naval movies I watched. they're going to be the captain of U-571 in the movie of the same name. By the way, insert unprintable expletives here, Studio Canal. They're still causing problems with falsely claiming that it's not a fair use of the content for review purposes. But nevertheless, the U-boat captain in that particular movie, who randomly decides to machine gun, not only machine gun survivors, which is something U-boat captains almost never did, and definitely didn't do at that point, and definitely didn't have orders from Hitler to do, but also chooses to machine gun survivors who quite probably had several people aboard who could help him out of his current predicament. So, yeah, that's definitely up there. And the other thing would be, just because it really irritated me, the random British admiral at the beginning of the movie Midway. Because, basically, when you look at who was actually the British naval attaché in Tokyo at that time, and any other British naval officers who were there, the attitude, etc., on display doesn't match any of them. And also pretty much everything he says is wrong, up to and including the caliber of gun he was looking forward to using, because it didn't exist yet. Could have just gone with the 15-inch gun. 15 or 16-inch gun would have been fine. Those guns were in service all the time. But no, they had to think, no, World War II, the British had the King George V, we must go with the 14-inch gun. Then set the scene at a time when the King George V wasn't yet in service. Slow hand clap. Well. I mean, I suppose he could have also been a clairvoyant. That might account for the reason he was so off the wall. But you never know. Jake Miller, yeah, let's say there are a few accounts of U-boats machine gunning survivors, but they didn't happen at that point. They didn't happen at that point in the war. B, it was incredibly rare. And C, it definitely wasn't done because of orders from above. I mean, for all the horrible things that Nazi Germany did, the closest they ever came to issuing orders to that effect were, don't actively go out of your way to pick up survivors. At no point did anyone in the Kriegsmarine High Command or Hitler's government order shoot survivors in the water without mercy, which is the excuse that is given in the movie. Yeah, when you make your literal Nazis even more horrible than actual Nazis, how you managed that, I'm not entirely sure. But they managed it. Chazix asks, if you're put in charge of the Kriegsmarine with all your knowledge and forced to design a battleship with 8 Schwere Gustav guns as its main armament, could it be built, assuming a special dry dock could be made for this project? And how much displacement do you think this ship would have, assuming all or nothing armor schemes and resistance to 18.1-inch gunfire? Could it be built not with anything that Germany has at that point in time? Could it be built if a special dockyard was made for this ship? Well, assuming we're talking about a Bismarck layout only with 31-inch guns, I'm going to go with probably not, because you'd be talking about a ship that's going to have a displacement. It's going to have a displacement north of 110 to 120,000 tons. At which point, even if you could build it, unless you build it more like a monitor, i.e. incredibly shallow, wide beam, and therefore slow, a ship of that size is almost certainly going to have a draft that's going to make getting out of German ports rather interesting. And if you're trying to stick armour against 18.1-inch guns in it, that's just going to send the displacement spiralling through the roof. Not to mention, you're going to have a rate of fire that would make the Sans Pareil look at you in pity. And that thing had a rate of fire of 1 shot every 5 minutes. Yeah. I genuinely don't think that could be done. Not realistically, in any case. You might be able to build a special dry dock that could fit a ship that was maybe taking 1 or 2 Schwere Gustavs mounted forward, but basically Bismarck, except with 31-inch guns, no. Jimmy the Fish asks, can you elaborate on anti-flash protection for ship's crews, in that was there protective clothing, anti-flash creams, etc., etc.? It obviously depends on the time period. World War I was when you saw the introduction of the first generation of anti-flash gear. It had some rather interesting characteristics depending on the nation. British anti-flash gear visually hasn't changed all that much over the 20th century. Other nations had some interesting takes on it. For example, search Austro-Hungarian Navy anti-flash gear, and the poor guys look like either sort of B-movie, horror movie extras, or possibly something off of the set of Doctor Who. They are quite unnerving. But in terms of the protective clothing, for a long time it was anti-flash hoods and gloves, basically covering the exposed areas of the skin. Some of the more advanced stuff that was full body stuff was it's just an extension of that. Makes you look weirdly like a KKK member, except without the pointy hat. But that's just a product of the fact it has to be white to help reflect the flash as much as possible, and it also has to be somewhat loose fitting, because you've got to fit it over everything else. And of course, if you're going into an environment where you might run into flash, you probably don't want it to be too close fitting, because then you'll start overheating very quickly, which in a hot environment is not really going to help. Anti-flash creams and such, I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of them particularly being around in World War I and World War II. It sounds like something they might have started developing partway through World War II, but from most of what I've read about damage control efforts, most anti-flash protection, at least for the period the channel covers, is limited to things like clothing, not the more advanced stuff that they might have these days. Kra F1 asks, given the interwar years were littered with weird and wonderful ideas of varying effectiveness, unrotated projectile launchers, the Blackburn, Deutschland class, converted carriers, Need for Speed Marine National Edition, what if someone somewhere decides to develop rocket assistance on a naval scale? Say electrolysis to produce hydrogen fuel from seawater. If they're able to throw absurd resources at the problem to make it happen, would anything useful have come from the idea, being defined as a dramatic increase in acceleration from cruising to top speed for battle or evasion? Or would so-equipped ships simply resemble a giant Roman candle? Well, yeah, probably the latter, to be perfectly honest, because one, rockets at that time period do have a rather disturbing habit of randomly exploding, which is not usually a good thing, especially if they're fixed to the back of your warship. And secondly, there's a whole other scale involved when it comes to rocket propulsion and shipping, because one, shipping, remember, has to move through the water, which is roughly 1,000 times denser than air. So the impulse from a rocket that might send a rocket flying through the sky at several hundred miles an hour, put that same impulse on the hull of a vessel that's pushing through the water, and you're not going to get anything quite like the same effect. And then you've got to take into account that, well, what's the best way of putting it? The mass is completely different. I mean, you look at a Saturn V. Okay, Saturn V, one of, if not the most powerful rocket ever put into service, and its all-up thrust, I think, was something in the order of 140 tons. Now, 140 tons of thrust to move something the size and weight of the Saturn V is quite useful. 140 tons of thrust on the back of a 35,000-ton battleship, on the other hand, I mean, sure, it'll push it a bit quicker, but at that point you've strapped a Saturn V to the back of your ship, which may cause some stability issues, and also makes you possibly the single best target that any gunner has ever dreamed about. So yeah, any kind of realistically non-suicidal sized rocket that you could strap to the back of a warship is equally not going to have anything close to the thrust to be of any particularly great use. Billy Tyson, do you have any favourite paranormal stories as related to the sea? Do tales like the ghost blimp from California in World War II or the Mary Celeste interest you? Paranormal stories, not particularly. If you want to lump them all generally into these sort of slightly odd stories or mystery stories from the sea, the ones that interest me the most are things like the Mary Celeste, where you have crews vanishing, etc., because it intrigues me to try and work out what actually happened to them, rather than, ooh, spooky. But if I'd have to say, if there's any one particular set of mysterious stories that come from the sea that I would be most interested in, then I would probably say actually more along the lines of some of the more reliable sightings by ships of what are quote unquote mythical sea creatures, because the Kraken was held to be complete myth for well into the 20th century until we discovered colossal and giant squid. I mean, okay, a colossal or giant squid, whilst it's very big, impressive, and scary, is not necessarily the full-on Kraken from some of the legends, but it's certainly a heck of a lot closer to the facts of the matter, especially if you imagine the size of ships that they used to go around in, than someone just dismissing it outright and saying, no, that's just not a thing. Now, when it comes to other things, you've got particularly sightings of things like what they call sea serpents, or really big sea snakes, that kind of thing. Future British monarchs have seen them in the 19th century on board Royal Navy warships, and the whole thing was attested to by multiple members of the crew. Not the kind of people to be easily taken by fancy, and people with quite a lot of public reputation to lose if it wasn't something that they genuinely thought they saw. Now, the one thing that makes me interested from a marine perspective is that we know nowadays that certain marine sea life is very badly affected by noise, sonar, engine noise, etc., etc. And a lot of sea life that does try to avoid those kinds of noises where possible, which you can understand. I mean, much in the same way that we don't particularly appreciate, say, living in a house with single pane glass windows right next to an active motorway. It's not a pleasant place to be. So the fact that a lot of these sightings come from earlier periods of sea travel, especially periods where ships are sailing around using sails, which obviously has a much lower sound profile, it does make me think that, given all the various odds and ends that keep popping up out of the seas even nowadays, it's entirely possible that there may be some relatively large creature that's relatively rare, lives in the ocean, perhaps somewhat more sensitive to noise even than whales and dolphins are, and therefore would occasionally be seen by the crews of sailing ships who didn't really bother it because, the ship's just coasting through the water. But nowadays would be exceptionally difficult to see, because the minute they saw the minute that they saw or heard, I guess, the sound of propellers beating through the water and everything, they just skedaddle off to some part of the ocean where shipping isn't that common. And believe it or not, there are fairly large expanses of ocean where shipping just flat out isn't that common. You could go into one of those areas and sail for days and not see anybody. But yeah, that would be my main interest in the kind of not strictly naval side of things. Elliot W. James. The journalist and naval historian H.W. Wilson wrote Ironclads in Action in 1897, The Downfall of Spain 1900, and Battleships in Action in 1919. He also wrote an epistolary novella, that sounds like something out of Warhammer 40k, on a war between Britain and the Franco-Russian alliance in late 1900. Wilson's war only lasted 4 months. How would you envision a naval war between these three powers playing out in 1900? It very much depends on how the war escalates to the point that fighting is breaking out. Because remember, the Russians at this point, they have their fleet split across multiple theatres, and none of those are particularly close to the main concentrations of the French fleet, and as well as their colonial stations and squadrons, the French fleet equally is also somewhat split. They're partly in the Mediterranean, partly in the Channel. So if it's a very sudden snap rise in tensions, just enough to mobilize ships but not enough to really relocate them, then the British are in a position to defeat the Franco-Russian naval forces in detail unless those forces turtle up and try and just stay in harbour, at which point the British have dominance of the seas and can begin a blockade. Because the British control Gibraltar so that they can keep the two halves of the French fleet from combining. The Russian Baltic fleet and Black Sea fleets are far enough away from their Atlantic and Mediterranean counterparts. It's going to take quite a while for them to get that anywhere. And at this point, the British Mediterranean fleet is their single most powerful fleet. So in the case of a snap war, the Mediterranean fleet probably moves in to try and take out the French Mediterranean fleet as quickly as possible, then heads up to either close off the Dardanelles or actively confront the Russian Black Sea fleet. And whichever one of those is done, then a portion of the Mediterranean fleet can then sail through Gibraltar, head round to join up with the Atlantic and Channel fleets, who are more than capable of holding their own against the French Channel-Atlantic forces. They can combine, they can suppress, knock out the French, and the Russians have a rather difficult choice of, do they sail from the Baltic? But how do they sail from the Baltic? They're not going to get through the Kiel Canal. They're going to have to go around Denmark, which is a perfect ambush site for the British. So, yeah, a snap war, not going to end well for the Franco-Russian alliance. If they have time, let's say they're planning a war with Britain, and they start sailing to prepare for that, then they could cause a lot more problems, because at that point you could take, say, the Baltic fleet out for a summer training cruise into the North Sea, and just so happen to be staying in French ports, ready to combine with the French Atlantic and Channel forces when the war breaks out. And likewise, either the French Mediterranean fleet can go towards the Dardanelles, or the Russian fleet can, and that allows them to meet up, at which point, when they can both meet up, combine and sail out, then they have a lot more chance of giving the Mediterranean and Atlantic and Channel fleets a relatively good fight. Although the Channel fight is probably going to be the single bloodiest one. But at that point, given the stakes, I suspect there'd be a lot of tap dancing around the issue while everyone desperately either gets ships out of mothballs to reinforce their fleets, or call ships back from foreign stations to increase the strength of their fleets. And neither side will be really willing to commit till they've absolutely done that and think they have the best shot they're going to get. At which point, it's really going to come down to who gets the better of the colonial overseas war. Whose foreign station squadrons are surviving when the dust settles after the first few months of the war, and therefore who can send the most reinforcements home in order to take up an offensive posture. Tyler Dunn, alternate history, the Iowa class, but the Yamato's design is leaked in 1938. Realistically, given the way that the US interpreted most intel data coming out of Japan that didn't agree with their idea that the Japanese could only copy in superior Western technology, where are we hearing that at the moment? They probably just bin the report and build the Iowas the way they wanted to anyway. If slightly saner heads prevail and they take a good long look at the Yamatos, then I don't think it's going to fundamentally change what the Iowas will be, because they're still going to want them for that niche. But you will probably see something resembling a Montana dragged kicking and screaming into life much earlier. So perhaps instead of laying down 4 Iowas, they'll do a very quick design job for the Montanas, and then they'll say, okay, well, we need both, so we're going to build 2 Iowas and 2 Montanas, and then the next run will be 2 Iowas and 2 Montanas, or possibly 2 of one or the other, depending on what their priorities are. Bajaki Hilmarson. Okay, you're right. That's a question for the next Drydock, because that's quite complicated. I don't know why that's ended up there. Oh, yeah, it's ended up there because that video is incredibly long. Basically, Bjarki asked me to review a video and let everyone know what my thoughts on it are. Problem is, the video is just over an hour long, and it takes a while to put my thoughts together on it. There's a lot of stuff to comment on in it. So, yeah, haven't managed to get around to that yet. The Outer Circle asks, a lot of folk like to talk up the Bismarck even now, but can you summarise for those who fall for the myth of the mega battleship just how hard the British killed her? Very is the answer. Now, see, this is the bizarre thing. The Bismarck, in the minds of people who think she was the best thing ever, seems to exist in this quantum superposition state of simultaneously being lethal and undefeatable and undamageable except by scuttling. And then when you point out, well, then why did she get knocked out so quickly in her last battle? And then they say, oh yes, but she was slow, she was wallowing, she wasn't a stable gunnery platform. Well, at that point she wasn't exactly invincible, was she? And to be fair to Bismarck, yeah, she wasn't exactly the swiftest or the most stable vessel at that point, but that's because she'd already had chunks taken out of her, because she wasn't an invincible super doom ship. Nonetheless, while she did have those disadvantages going for her, the simple fact remains that Rodney slammed a bunch of 16-inch shells into her pretty quickly, followed by King George V with 14-inch shells, and she was rendered combat ineffective pretty darn quickly. Yeah, she took a little bit of time to sink, but, you know, that's not exactly surprising. Within 20 minutes or so of the engagement properly beginning, her command crew were dead. At least the upper echelons of her command crew were gone. Primary fire control was out. Half the secondary fire control was out. Her forward turrets were out. I mean, Rodney put a 16-inch shell through Bruno turret so hard it hit the back of the turret and knocked the back armor plate off the turret. And just look at what's left of the wreck. The upper decks are a complete ruin. And yeah, people will say, oh, she took such a battering and it took such a long time to go down. May I point out, Kirishima, if you look at Kirishima and Bismarck, okay, no one doubts Kirishima got completely trashed by Washington. And no one's going to stand up and say, oh yes, the Kirishima, the Congo-class battlecruiser, is a fine example of really durable battleship construction. From the time the first shell hit from Washington hit Kirishima to when it sank is longer than the time from when the first British shell hit Bismarck to when Bismarck sank. So unless you're going to hold up Kirishima as an example of, you know, British and Japanese design efforts from World War I for battle cruisers somehow being a superior construction and more durable than German World War II battleship design, you can't really go pointing to Bismarck's time afloat after taking the first hit as evidence of it being particularly durable. So, yeah. As I say, you do have to avoid, with Bismarck, you do have to avoid overcorrecting and making it out to be a terrible ship. As I pointed out before, she's an inefficient ship. So she's a ship that weighs in the low to mid 40,000s of tons, depending on whether she's lightly loaded or fully loaded. So she displaces more than a Littorio. She's not quite at the displacement of an Iowa, but she's closer to the displacement of an Iowa than she is to the displacement of a treaty battleship. And for all that, you get something that can reasonably go toe-to-toe with most of the treaty battleships. Which, again, as I said before, it's kind of like a heavyweight boxer entering the middleweight league somehow and doing okay. That's not the mark of a great boxer. That's the mark of probably actually a pretty poor boxer who's just taking advantage of extra mass. And similarly, Bismarck is a very inefficient design that could have been done on probably 5,000 tons less easily, and quite easily. Possibly could even have been fitted into actual treaty restrictions with a little bit of finagling. But for all that, was kind of a, if you want to use a sort of a 1 to 10 scale, maybe a 6 or a 7 out of 10. When you compare her to the other treaty battleships, where 5 is an average. Matt Osborne asks, if you now take the place of Admiral Beatty at 3:49 p.m. on May 31st, 1916, as the stragglers of your battlecruiser squadron emerged to fire on the Germans, one of the following Allied ships has crossed time and space to join the fight: Fuso, La France, or Gangot. Which one do you choose, and why is it not La France? Well, I'm not taking La France because she's actually got a shorter range than the rest of my battle cruisers, so she's basically useless except as a target. If they cross time and space to join the fight, then it actually makes it quite interesting, because Fuso, obviously at the time of the Battle of Jutland, is, should we say, not necessarily in a fit state to fight the Battle of Jutland. Oh, between Fuso and Gangot, that's a really difficult one, actually. They've got approximately the same speed. Fuso's got bigger guns, but Gangot's 12-inch are nice. That's quite the query. I think I'd probably just about edge taking Fuso, simply because you've got 12 guns in both cases, and the 14-inch shells are probably going to do a little bit more damage. But I certainly wouldn't say no to seeing Gangot there. I'd be quite happy to have Gangot along. Jeff31818, I did see your question. I have it listed here. I'm just trying to go through, clear some of the Patreon questions as quickly as I can, whilst giving a comprehensive answer, but I will get to your question. Tyler Kuhn asks, if the Germans cause enough damage to the Royal Navy at the Battle of Jutland to convince the US to send a convoy to Germany with a naval escort under orders not to turn around under any circumstances, what would this fleet consist of, and how would the UK respond? Would they allow the convoy through, or would they have the Royal Navy attack it and risk war with the United States? They'd certainly try to block it, although it's difficult to see what kind of battle would cause enough damage to the Grand Fleet that the US would somehow feel confident enough to try and ramrod through a single convoy under escort from its battle fleet, when that damage also just doesn't completely negate the Grand Fleet itself. You know, the US isn't going to suddenly, in turn itself, risk a war with the UK if the UK still has a numerical advantage or parity with the Germans, because that means that shortly thereafter they're going to have a numerical advantage again. So it would have to be an utterly devastating battle, and if it is devastating enough that the US somehow is persuaded to try and either strong-arm Britain or join the war against it, certainly risk joining the war against it, then it's probably also the kind of damage to the ground fleet where they're just not going to be in a state to intercept the convoy at all. They might want to. The Harwich force might try to make them stand down, but at that point, with the level of damage that would be necessary to incur that scenario, the Grand Fleet at that point is basically holding the line as the last-ditch coastal defence force. Don't worry, Jeff, I kind of switch between the super chats and the Patreon questions as best I can, but there's a reasonable amount of questions to get through, shall we say. Don't worry, I'm here for the long run. I've still got half my iron brew, so even if it has been a bit of a tiring day. Admiral Tiberius, has there ever been other cases in history of a family like the Hood family in any other navy, i.e. long-serving and highly distinguished commands? What about other long family histories in the Royal Navy? I have answered a question similar to this before. There have been a few generational families in other navies. I'm aware that they exist. I'm not 100% off the top of my head aware of exactly what family lines they are. But certainly in the Royal Navy there are quite a few. Parkers, Hydes, Samaritzes, etc. As well as obviously the Hoods. And for that, I did in another question I answered in a previous Drydock, I did actually go through a number of the more longer serving Royal Navy families. So I will refer you to that answer if you don't mind. If you need to know which particular episode it is, just drop me a line on Discord or etc. and I'll see if I can track down which Drydock it was. Cody asks, you and Mrs. Drac are dropped on an island of English-speaking Neo-Stone Age natives with only the contents of your garage toolbox, metalworking for dummies book, and a sack of various potatoes. After much careful negotiation, Drac manages to convince the local chiefs that if he were to build them a boat, then they won't throw him and Mrs. Drac into the communal stew pot. After finding a source of iron ore and setting up a small smelter to make tools and planting potatoes in a small garden next to their new hut, how does Drac go about determining what kind of wood he'll be using for this boat and what kind of boat it will be? That depends entirely on what kind of environment I'm in, because I'm not building out of softwood, because I like life. So it's going to have to be ideally a wood that can season well. But then on the other hand, if it's a tropical island style thing and the only thing available is palm, what the heck? Sorry, there was just some very weird complex noises a second ago. Anyway, yeah, if it's palm, then I can build some canoes, maybe a trimaran canoe, maybe some rafts. I'm not really gonna try and go any further than that with that kind of material. But otherwise, I would look for... I don't think I'd go for oak, because that would imply I'm building a very large ship, and if it's just me and Mrs. Drac, sorry, but I'm not building a first-rate ship of the line on my own. I'd probably try and build something like a pinnace or a longboat, if I could, and so that would probably be something like ash or cedar, maybe elm if I can get my hands on it, something along those lines. Something that's going to season relatively well, is pretty strong, somewhat flexible, and can be shaped a lot easier and is somewhat less dense than oak. So at that point, I'd go for something, say, like a longboat or something like that. They're not that difficult to build on the grand scheme of things. Oh, right, okay. The sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning asks, I know this is outside the normal scope of the channel. Right, that is a 21st century question. So I'll try and drop you my thoughts via email or similar if you want to drop me an email. But as I said, I don't go that deep into post-1950s technology questions, etc. on this channel. 2 seconds. Right, sorry about that, everyone. Just had to close a couple of doors so you wouldn't get random conversations popping along in the background. Anyway, Vintage Car History saying whatever you were hearing, it was not coming through the podcast. That's surprising, considering I could hear it. I just realised something. I could hear it coming through my headphones. And my headphones have pretty good sound isolation, so I thought you might be able to pick up on it as well through the microphone. I've also realised I've been wearing my headphones this entire time, haven't I? Why am I wearing my headphones? You guys are speaking to me through chat. Oh well. One of these days I'm going to learn. Anyway. Christopher Dent asks, what would have happened had the Argentines taken advantage of British distractions and invaded the Falklands 40 years earlier in 1942? Nothing particularly good, because the Falklands were used as a base by the Royal Navy at that point for refueling and refitting to patrol the South Atlantic against German raiders. For example, Exeter went there to patch up her wounds after the battle with Graf Spee. Cumberland was there during the battle with Graf Spee. So for the Argentinians to randomly turn around and go, right, we're taking this, let's just say the British would take a very dim view of that. And bearing in mind that that's 1942, they'd probably ask the Americans to help swing past and deal with that as well. Which probably means that American forces preparing for Operation Torch and working up in the south, in the Atlantic, following coming into service and commissioning, probably meet up with the local British forces, probably everything the British have operating in the southern Indian Ocean, from Madagascar, the South Atlantic, maybe even the Central Atlantic, and they're just all going to gang up and retake the Falklands with prejudice. So Reginald Lee IV asks, looked at in hindsight, it seems like the Washington Naval Treaty ultimately led to little more than hamstrung ship designs, inadequate modernizations, and the premature elimination of the battleship as a primary force, and needlessly broken diplomatic goodwill. Nations started trying to find ways around the limitations, or flatly ignoring them, even before the ink was dry. Those that stuck to the said limitations were often left with ships that were inadequate at best and dangerous at worst, and uneven restrictions led to bad blood between former allies, particularly with the US driving a wedge between the UK and Japan. My question is, what might the world have looked like if the Washington Naval Treaty had never happened? I've covered this particular scenario a few times before on the Drydocks, but the short version is that Japan is almost certainly going to have to bow out of the building race from an economic perspective in the mid to late 1920s. Her economy is completely unable to keep up even with the level they'd need for a deterrent force against a US and UK who are going flat out after a naval race. Now, when it comes to both the US and the UK, they're in interesting positions because politically the UK can't be seen to lose its spot at the top. They might just accept parity with the Americans, like they did at Washington, but the needs of empire mean they cannot drop down to second. But economically, they're not in as good a position as the US because, the whole First World War thing. The US is in a better economic position, but politically, they're in a worse position because the new administration that comes in the early 1920s is a lot more isolationist than the previous administration that passed the 1916 Naval Act. And as a result, both the American public at the time, and the majority of the American politicians are looking at a way to try and dial back naval spending. So I suspect that the programs would probably have been curtailed anyway, maybe at 4 and 4, Lexington's and South Dakota's. Maybe they would have continued the whole lot, depending on what the exit clauses on the various construction treaties are. But I suspect that both the US and the UK would have tried to keep up. The G3s and the N3s would have been laid down. Some people have gone on in the past about, the UK couldn't afford it. Yes, they actually could. Despite all the war debts, despite all the other issues that were happening with the British economy in the 1920s, the British government during that period, believe it or not, was actually reducing the national debt at quite a significant pace. If you not halve the rate of government spending in other departments, if you just halve the rate at which the British are reducing their national debt year on year, so they're still reducing that debt, just not as quickly, that alone frees up enough money for them to pay for a battleship building race. They're not going to like it, but they can do it. By the mid to late 1920s, so we're talking about maybe 1926, 27, I think everything's probably going to be dying down pretty quickly. If for economy's sake, if nothing else, similar to what, when we were discussing earlier about if the treaty had allowed the ships then under construction to complete, all the not 14 and not 15-inch gunships will be long gone. The first generation of the 1920s ships will be coming into service, and then depending on whose political outlook you believe, it's either going to lead to a big spike in tensions between the US and the UK, which might lead to some kind of war, or it might lead to both sides just kind of pacing themselves down again and settling into a maybe 2-ship-a-year building program to try and maintain what they think is an approximate level of parity. And then, of course, the Great Depression's going to hit, which is going to just throw a massive curveball to everybody else. And them as well, obviously. Trevoris asks, the year is 1778. A ship has arrived with a letter of marque, and they're giving you the opportunity to sail the seas for American gold. It almost sounds too good to be true. With your knowledge of naval history, how would you determine whether sailing on this vessel would be a great opportunity to chase fortune, or whether it's likely to leave to leave you not best pleased? Please give answers for both if you are and are not given full access to the ship to check out things beforehand. Okay, so let's have a look. So, (1778). Okay, so that's approaching the beginning of the Forever War with France, of that period. In fact, it's in between the Forever one of the Forever Wars with France and the next one. How would I determine whether sailing on the vessel would be a good opportunity? I'd look at the stern. And if the stern is a ship name that I recognise from my research as, you know, a ship that actually made a fairly good return on investment with not too many casualties, then I'll sail on it. If I don't recognise it, or if I recognise it from the "and went aground in a hurricane in the Caribbean" entries of history, then I'm not getting on the blasted thing. That's basically all I need to know. Ash the Lego guy asks, how bad would the October 1945 typhoon have been to the invasion efforts of Operation Downfall, assuming all the same Pacific admirals were in their same command positions as in early August 45? Assuming Halsey has been sidelined, what would and then assuming Halsey was sidelined, what would likely change from the Allied invasion plan from a Navy perspective? If Halsey isn't involved, then the US Navy is probably going to be slightly less aggressive about things, because he is, you know, one of the most aggressive admirals they've got. In terms of the typhoon effect on the invasion efforts of Downfall, it basically depends on when exactly they launch Downfall. If the typhoon arrives whilst the invasion is in progress, about to launch, or has shortly been launched, kind of probably a 2-3 week window, then it could be disastrous, because you're looking at, you know, landing ships and landing craft that really aren't designed for that kind of weather being subjected to that kind of weather, which is going to be a mass casualty event if ever there was one. Plus, it's going to make it very difficult for Allied aircraft and capital ships to support the landings, which is going to give the Japanese defenders a fairly big advantage. Whereas if it happens, you know, 3-4 weeks after the landings have taken place, then it might interrupt things a little bit, but by that point some fairly decent supply lines and beachheads will have been established, and it's unlikely to massively cause a problem for everybody, because, you know, the typhoon will ground everybody's aircraft. I mean, it benefits the Japanese more, but there's not a window in that for mass kamikaze attacks to come in or whatever. If it happens shortly before they commence the landings, I mean, it could have some disruption in the invasion fleet, but at that point, most of the landing craft at sea are going to be the bigger, more durable ones, with the smaller ones on board them. So it could be bad, depending on exactly how bad it gets. But the main thing, if anything, will just be it'll bog everything down when it comes to an advance. Where are we? Kevin Wise, what happens in World War II if Yamamoto either doesn't exist or is killed or discharged at Tsushima? Depends entirely who takes charge instead of him. Again, this is a question I have covered a few times before. It's Yamamoto had a fairly decent tactical and strategic mind on him. He knew that a long-term war with America wasn't winnable, but he did at least plan out a strategy to allow them to inflict a lot of heavy blows on America before, obviously, things began to turn. If he isn't in charge, yeah, it's an almost impossible thing to tell. It is going to depend on who steps into his place, because then it's not as easy as saying, oh, well, who was the next rank down from Yamamoto, we'll put him in charge, because without Yamamoto without Yamamoto working his way up his career and obviously having his favourites and people he disagreed with, the entire high command structure of the Japanese Navy may be very different. Or it might be relatively similar, but it's not exactly easy to predict. Colin Cameron. When in command of USS Cassin, Ernest King gets annoyed with the Royal Navy blockade and attacks one of the cruisers. Presuming that his XO relieves him of command before the destroyer is sunk and the US Navy convicts him of treason for trying to start a war, what is the result for US participation in both World War I and World War II? One rogue destroyer commander is probably not really going to change all that much for US participation in World War I. World War II, on the other hand, is an entirely different matter because, as you will have seen from my video on the life of Admiral King, he did an incredibly good job of centralizing and organizing the US war effort. Yes, of course, he made mistakes. Everyone does. And yes, the convoy aspect of things and his relationship with the British and the US's relationship, therefore, with the British will probably be a little bit smoother. But on the other hand, without someone like King sitting up there at the top, the Navy might very well be a little bit more disjointed, a little bit more disunited, much more susceptible to political pressure and pressure from the other services, especially when it comes to MacArthur wanting to have his own operational theatre in the Pacific. So, whilst probably not a lot changes for World War One, World War Two, especially considering some of the other stuff that King was involved with, you know, trying to up the US's anti-aircraft gun arrangements immediately prior to the war, etc. Yeah, the US and the Allied cause as a whole probably would suffer quite severely if with the absence of King. It's not going to change the overall outcome of the war, but it is going to increase casualties and possibly draw it out. Well, not draw it out because the atom bombs are going to draw a rather definitive line under it, but the Allied forces may be slightly further back from the Japanese coast than they are historically by that point, and there'll be a much bigger body count. Tevildo, I'll take your word for it. I'm just reading the question as it says. Salty Viking 10,022. What would the reaction of the Royal Navy have been if? Would the reaction of the Royal Navy have been the same if Prince of Wales had her magazine detonated by Bismarck instead of Hood? So, assuming Hood survives and withdraws, somewhat damaged, and Prince of Wales blows up, they're going to be very confused as to how that happened. Would the reaction be the same? Yeah, pretty much. I mean, yes, okay. Hood's destruction because she was Hood made it a lot more emotive, and brand new battleship still with civilian workers aboard being lost in a battle that arguably she probably shouldn't have been put into in the first place is a little bit easier for the Royal Navy to stomach and explain away, at least in public. In private, they're going to be wondering what the heck went so badly wrong. Like, where did the incredibly heavily armor protection of King George V battleship fail that it got a magazine detonation at that kind of range? So internally, a lot of panicking, possibly speculation about either super lucky shots or possibly that maybe Bismarck has more powerful weaponry than anybody thought it did. But ultimately, it's still a battleship having sunk a British battleship, which is now potentially free to raid the oceans. And with that kind of display of power, the old battleships escorting the convoys not really in a position to do all that much. So the intensity of the hunt for Bismarck probably is going to be about the same. Loch Ness Hamster, in your video on USS Franklin, you mentioned the anti-aircraft guns firing in automatic mode. What exactly does this mean? Were the guns able to fire without human intervention? No, automatic mode basically means that they're slaved to the fire control systems, and the job of the gun crews at that point is largely to, where necessary, follow the instructions of the fire control systems and just feed it ammunition. Whereas if they're under local control, then the gun crews are responsible for training, elevation, when the gun fires, etc., etc. Whereas in automatic mode, It's a case of the gun's doing this thing. You feed it ammunition, gun go boom. If you don't feed it ammunition, you get very angry words from your commanding officer. Sky asks, if Bismarck hadn't been so lucky in targeting Hood, i.e. Hood's magazine doesn't explode for whatever reason, what are the chances that Hood and Prince of Wales would have sunk both Bismarck and Prince Eugen, or at least leave them damaged beyond economical repair? It's an interesting one. It depends exactly how bad that shell hit is and, you know, what happens as a result. So in my what if Hood didn't blow up, I speculated, you know, what happens if the shell hit happens as it did in real life, but the fuse was faulty. At that point, Hood is forced to withdraw because she's got massive flooding in one of her engine rooms, which, you know, does have a little bit of a mobility effect on battleships and battle cruisers. So the battle probably would wind down from that point anyway, simply because apart from anything, Hood can no longer keep up, plus the list that she'd have been developing. So that's the sort of closest to what historically happened outcome. If the shell misses entirely, and Hood just sails along quite merrily, it does bring up some interesting possibilities, because Norfolk and Suffolk are minutes away from joining the battle, and of course they can take over shooting at Prince Eugen, and they've got shots from a completely different angle that the Germans aren't. Well, they know they're expecting, but they can't engage both sets at once, at which point it's 2 capital ships and 2 heavy cruisers versus a battleship and a heavy cruiser. What happens after that is entirely down to who hits who when. Prince of Wales, obviously, as we know, got some nice hits on Bismarck, but you know, just because Bismarck didn't kill Hood with that salvo, she had the range, she was on target, she would have hit Hood more. And how long does Hood stand up under that fire? How long does Hood get the range and start hitting Bismarck, potentially disrupting Bismarck's fire, forcing it to break off? It's one of those scenarios where if you give both sides 5-10 more minutes to blaze away at each other, it could go any which way. But the longer the battle continues, the greater the chances the British have, purely because weight of guns is on their side, and once Norfolk and Suffolk show up, weight of ships is on their side as well. Okay, we're down to the last Patreon question. Then it's super chats, and then it's everybody and everybody else. Yeah, I know. I put Drydock of October 3rd down, thinking that's I know why it was. It's because when I set up this live stream ready to go, I actually set it up just after midnight UK time, and I didn't realise the date had switched over because I didn't realise it was after midnight. So I was mentally counting forward the number of days I thought it was till Saturday, and then put, you know, what therefore came to the 3rd, and it was actually technically the next day. So basically it confused me. I then changed the actual live stream time to the 2nd, but obviously forgot to edit the text of the title. Right, so the last Patreon question of the evening is, what if in a non-Washington Treaty timeline, US Congress gets ultra-nationalist, decides to throw money at the US Navy, makes 6 Tillman 4-2s for its battle line post South Dakota, and 4 Tillman 2s post Lexingtons? How would the world react? By going to war with these fleet of abominations before this fleet of abominations is commissioned, attempting to match them, or just ceding naval dominance? If the US has lost the plot so much it's building 10 Tillman battleships, I think at that point someone somewhere is going to try and make them stop. Although, to be honest, given the sheer silliness of the Tillman 4.2s, they might also allow them to be constructed out of a sense of morbid curiosity, because for all the sheer amount of firepower they have, the 4.2s don't have the world's best armor protection. The Tillman 2s as well, so they might in a non-treaty world, you're talking about the Anglo-Japanese alliance still going strong, so they might decide that, if the US has lost the plot enough to be spending that amount of money on those ships, they'll just build significantly more, slightly smaller, slightly less capable but saner vessels, and then have a massive numerical advantage. Right. It'd be interesting to see, though. Alright, let's see what the old Super Chat questions have. Floafi asks, are there actual photos of the sign on Enterprise, i.e. Enterprise versus Japan, or is it just a legend? I recall seeing a photo somewhere of the sign. I definitely recall it, and it's attested to by multiple sailors from Enterprise, so I'm pretty sure it's not a legend. I'm pretty sure it did actually happen, and to be honest, it is exactly the kind of thing I'd expect an American warship in the situation that Enterprise was in at that point to do to boost its morale. Whiskey Delta Golf, how would the Royal Navy respond to a Tillman 4.2? Probably by laughter, as I say. They would be completely insane boondoggles, so the Royal Navy would probably thank its lucky stars that someone was stupid enough to sink the amount of resources needed to build a Tillman 4.2 into a Tillman 4.2, and then just go, okay, well, you do you, I guess. They'd probably come up with some kind of sketch design to try and work out, yes, we do something similar, but realistically they're just going to kind of be slightly confused that anyone thought this was a good idea, because you can build a ship with 16 inches of armor and 18-inch guns and 25 plus knots on a lot less displacement and a lot less cost than a 4.2. The only thing you can't do with that a 4.2 can on its ridiculous amount of tonnage is have 15 of the blasted things. But if you can get two ships with 9 18-inch guns with the same kind of armor and the same kind of speed, well, now you can double team the 4.2. You've got two separate targets, and also if you're not fighting a 4.2, you can be in two separate places at once, which is probably a better buy. And the Tillman 4 with the ridiculous sextuple gun mounts, that's just begging for a turret hit. There's just going to be so much ammunition and so many charges in that turret that even if they're observing the strictest of ammunition controls, yeah, that'll be a bang. Fanderson UFO, any videos from Tankfest? I do have some videos from Tankfest, albeit, they're about tanks. So, I met a few interesting people there. Met a few other content creators. Met a few people I've met before, which was very nice. And met a bunch of new guys, fans and viewers, etc. And that was very nice talking to you. I was quite happy that a lot of you that I met were quite happy to kind of sit down and have extended chats about things randomly. I did particularly like one person who said he wanted to take a selfie with me just to convince his dad that yes, in fact, YouTubers are real. I'm not a myth. At least I think so. Yeah, Lynn Martin, if you're... sorry, I'm just looking at what Lynn Martin's question. Okay, so Lynn Martin, there's the Patreon question threads. Basically, each month a thread goes up, and you can post a question in there, and then that's where from there. That's where I take the questions that then get put either into the big dry dock that's coming up tomorrow, or this one, depending on the type of question. Right. Bob Fry asks, what are the large Japanese characters painted on the side of some of their ships? They're actually ship names. You see them a lot on the destroyers in the 1930s. So if you have a decently clear shot of the side of the ship, then you can get a Japanese alphabet up and piece together from the characters what exactly that ship is, because it's basically a giant nameplate, which is quite fun, and to be honest, actually is very useful, because at least for the 1930s, because when you see fleets of destroyers, or flotillas of destroyers, I guess, maneuvering, pennant numbers are all well and good, but the pennant numbers tend to be slightly smaller and therefore possibly slightly less clear than those massive great kanji that the Japanese painted on the side of their ships, which means that with a lot of pictures of British, French, Italian, American destroyers, etc. from that period, you can identify it's a insert class name here destroyer, but figuring out exactly which one it is can be a bit more difficult if you don't have that information already recorded with the photo. Whereas for the Japanese, it's like, yes, well, assuming that they didn't use 2 potatoes and half a pair of binoculars to take this photo, we can work out exactly what this destroyer is, because there's sort of 20-foot high letters telling us. Yes, Smiling Nid, I did see your question for this month coming up. Isolde 74, how would you make USS Galena into an actual working vessel? Don't make her with iron. She did perfectly well as a standard sloop. Just don't put the iron on. It was a dumb idea. Redneck Fury, what exactly made the 8-inch autoloader so much more reliable than the US and Royal Navy 6-inch and US Navy 3-inch autoloaders? A little bit of time, and the fact it's just a substantially larger weapon. So the 8-inch, the reason the Des Moines, as you would have seen from this morning's video, the reason the Des Moines class missed the Second World War was because there were delays in getting her 8-inch mounts into service in the turrets, but that left more development time, which meant more time to, get things right. Plus, an 8-inch autoloader, it's just a much bigger, much beefier piece of technology than something for a 3-inch or a 6-inch, and also, has a slightly slower rate of fire, albeit not that much slower, and that means that it's just physically going to be a stronger thing. So you're building it more massively. You've got time to work out a few of the kinks, and then once it starts firing, yes, it's got much heavier recoil to deal with, obviously, but you're not having to cycle it quite as fast as the 6-inch and the 3-inch, which means that there's a little bit more time, a little bit, not quite as many jerky movements, and so it becomes a much, much more reliable weapon. Autoloaders are one of those odd things where if you're going for rate of fire, they become, as kind of your main benefit, they actually become more reliable the bigger they get, because your rate of fire is still not insane. It might be insane for a weapon of that size, but it's not 3-inch autoloader style insane. And time is a huge factor when it comes to these kind of things, especially with the amount of heat that firing large guns generates, whether it's 3, 6 or 8-inch. Frank Spazzato asks, at Jutland, right after the second engagement by the battle lines, the German pre-dreads seem to have beaten back the battle cruisers. What happened in this part of the battle? So the pre-dreadnoughts didn't beat back the British battlecruisers. What happened was the remnants of the battlecruiser force were pursuing the remnants of First Scouting Group, and it looked like they might actually be able to overhaul them because combination of damage and gradually gunking up boilers meant First Scouting Group was reduced in speed. Then Rear Admiral Mauve and his pre-dreadnoughts got in on the action. They basically cut in across the path of the British advance, and that meant the British battlecruisers had to engage them in a gunnery duel, which they did. And the British battlecruisers got the better of that gunnery duel, but by the time it was clear that they were getting the upper hand, the pre-dreadnoughts had done their job, which was they'd held the British up long enough for the German battlecruisers to vanish off into the darkness, at which point there was little point in the British continuing the pursuit because they didn't know exactly where the German battlecruisers had gone, and from previous experience, they're also conscious that by now they might very well run into the High Seas Fleet, as evidenced by the fact they had in fact run into an element of the High Seas Fleet in the pre-dreadnoughts. They didn't know what else might be coming to help, and although they were winning the gunfight, they weren't winning it fast enough, so they couldn't afford to just blow past the pre-dreads because the pre-dreadnoughts would still then be able to shoot at them on the way past, at which point the battlecruisers decided, well, there's no, like, we could sit here and duke it out and kill these pre-dreadnoughts, fine, but that doesn't actually achieve all that much in the grand scheme of things compared to what we were trying to do. It eliminates us from ability of being able to potentially chase them down later on, and it puts us at risk from the other battle squadrons of the High Seas Fleet showing up, so they withdrew to try and do something else. So yeah, it is a fine line between delayed the British and forced them to reconsider their plans and beating them back. But I think the thing is, beating them back implies the British didn't have a choice. They did, but they just elected to not continue the engagement at that point. Frank Sposato also asks, what might the sci-fi equivalent of an ironclad look like? In dystopian wars, what do you think the British war rotors engineering spaces look like? I do love me the Britannian war rotors. They actually designed an even bigger, better one to fight the French... Oh, for the love of Pete, I can't remember. The Tourbillon is the twin-hull airship. They've got Vauban, that's it. The French Vauban Sky Fortress. I actually designed a British war rotor to fight that. I've got the 3D model as well somewhere. Just need to find someone with a good 3D printer. Anyway, sci-fi equivalent of an ironclad. It depends what kind of sci-fi you're going for, but engineering spaces in dystopian wars are probably actually remarkably calm affairs because Sturginium allows the ships to be made out of much lighter materials, so you can just supply power from fairly regular steam engines, obviously, or Sturginium enhanced steam engines, and you get all the necessary power quite happily. So they're probably not going to resemble... They're probably going to resemble a calm, well-organised battleship or battlecruiser engine room. Whereas, as I say, depending on where you're taking your sci-fi, if you're taking it off into more magical sci-fi, soft sci-fi, then that's one thing. Whereas if you take it down the more hard sci-fi route, where for whatever reason the ironclads just didn't go away, or it's taken a Jules Verne-ish twist, then it could be all sorts of things. It could be nice, humming, quiet, almost nuclear powered. It could be an absolute sort of hell pit on Earth, or anything in between. But this, if you mean sci-fi equivalent of an ironclad in terms of spaceborne stuff, so a ship that relies primarily on its defences and carries numerous smaller guns compared to, turreted ships. I suppose they're ironclads as well. I mean, I know in 30k, Warhammer 30k technically, in the Horus Heresy, the Salamanders had a ship called the Saw Rod, which was described as an ironclad. And for whatever reason, I think it didn't have void shields. It just relied on insanely strong armour to get in close. But, I mean, the sci-fi equivalent of an ironclad, if you take an ironclad in the context of the period it's in, it's a battleship. If you take the ironclad in kind of the pop culture context, it's going to be a very heavily armoured, somewhat slower warship, i.e. something that you could outrun quite easily, but if it catches you, or if you have to break past it for whatever reason, it's just going to annihilate everything within gun range. So yeah, Galdir Yonai pointing out, yeah, if you were going kind of maybe down a mid scale in terms of hardness and softness sci-fi route, an ironclad might be, say, the first ship with a working deflector shield set, whereas everybody else is relying on dodging and hull plating. Animal 16365. Before the advent of tugboats, how did they move ships to and from docks, piers, dry docks and such? Depending on the size of ship, either under its own power or with rowboats. So there would be some form of tugboat. Basically, ships would either be small enough to maneuver on their own, which was quite common in ancient times, and once they got to a point where they were perhaps a bit too unwieldy to safely navigate their own way towards a dock, pier or dry dock, you'd either use possibly even the ship's own boats attached to ropes to row them in, or if you didn't absolutely need to be on a dock or pier, you might just drop anchor and use your boats to ferry goods to and from. Maxwell Looney, swordfish with torpedo versus Japanese 25mm anti-aircraft plane alarm. Who wins? Also, how far back down the plane tech tree and airdropped anti-ship weapon tech tree do you have to go for the 25mm to be effective? Depends how many 25mm you've got, but if you're talking about an average number of 25mm and it's just 25mm, they're probably going to struggle dealing with a swordfish dropping its torpedo. The 25mm has a slightly longer range than obviously a 20mm because it's got it, but obviously the much slower rate of fire, and you've got the problem that the ammunition is relatively likely to pass through the swordfish rather than detonate on or in the swordfish, which means that the few hits you might get with your slow rate of fire probably aren't going to do a tremendous amount unless you total the engine or something like that. And, you know, even though it's long range for a light anti-aircraft weapon, it's still a light anti-aircraft weapon. So if you're talking about a Japanese ship that's just got 25mm, the swordfish is probably going to get its attack run in almost mostly done, and then going to come out on under 25mm fire towards the end of its run, at which point it's probably going to get its attack off. And then whether or not it escapes out of that 20mm hail of fire is going to depend on how many guns you've got and how lucky they are. A few 25mm guns, it's entirely possible the swordfish just drops its torpedo and meanders off, wondering what all the fuss was about. Some of the insane levels of 25mm the Japanese had in the late war, they might be able to bring it down just by sheer weight of shot and hitting something vital like an engine or pilot. But at the same time, to be honest, the mid-1930s is probably about as far back as you can go in that case, because if you go much before the mid-1930s, then the aircraft get even more fragile, the torpedoes get even closer range, and therefore the 25mm effectiveness, such as it is going to go up quite significantly. Frank Spazzato, is the camo pattern on the Warspite when she's beached and refusing to get scrapped the same as when she was at D-Day? It's possible. They're very similar. Let's just check some photos. Warspite on D-Day. And Warspite beached. Let's check the patterns. Usefully, all the photos taken of Warspite on D-Day seem to be taken from her port side, and all the photos of her beach taken from her starboard side, which is not particularly helpful. But the pattern looks to be pretty similar, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it is, in fact, the same. That's her port side there. There's a rare photo taken from the other side. So let's have a look. Band, sweep back. Yes, she's basically wearing exactly the same camo pattern when she goes ashore as she does at D-Day. The patterning is exactly the same, and I think any difference in coloration on the photos is probably down to the light levels in question. Frank Spelzato, also being very generous today, asks, what is the name-date of the very last ship you would precisely cover on your channel worldwide? Still plenty of gun-armed smaller ships everywhere. It's going to be something around the time of the Korean War. I've previously said I'd probably draw the line at the cancelled USS America supercarrier. That seems like a fairly neat place to draw the line. But I might be persuaded just about to maybe stretch to the Forestals. And there's a bunch of obviously hypothetical gun-equipped designs like the Minotaurs, etc., that were being come up with in the late 40s, early 50s. The precise name date of the very last ship I'd cover on the channel, it'd be very difficult to pin down, but I think it would be either one of the hypothetical gun-equipped ship designs that were generated in the immediate post-war environment, so Stalingrads, Minotaurs, etc., etc., or the Forestals, whichever is later. Joshua S., who do you think deserves the credit for the US victory at Santiago de Cuba, Schley or Sampson? My vote is Schley, since he commanded the battle. It's pretty unarguable, really. He who commands the fight is usually the one who should get the credit. Look at, for example, Nelson's attack on Copenhagen. Theoretically, Nelson was subordinate to Admiral Parker further back, but virtually no one talks about the battle as being Parker's victory over the Danes at Copenhagen. It's Nelson's victory. So, yeah, I think I'd agree with you there. Whiskey Delta Golf, what would Nelson's post-war refit have looked like? I don't entirely know. The details, as far as I'm aware, were still fairly sketchy. But I suspect that it would have looked something along the lines of, obviously they're going to keep the 16-inch guns. It would have involved complete replacement of the machinery. I suspect, given that she was designed with fairly minimal machinery in the first place, it's probably not going to significantly reduce the overall machinery footprint. So they're going to just go with as much modern machinery as they can to boost her speed, because they will need her to be moving a bit quicker than 23-ish knots. And then the entire stern, gun arrays, etc., aircraft facilities are all going to be removed. The existing superstructure is probably fairly decent for mounting radars and such, because it's a Queen Anne's Mansion style. But aft, you're probably going to see, if they're talking post-war refit, they're probably going to put a bunch of auto-loading 3-inch, maybe 4.5-inch on the back to be the dual-purpose or AA gunnery mountings. If it's gone in for a full refit, so it's probably not coming out till the early 50s, I think that's probably all. Then by that point, they won't be putting Bofors on. So yeah, speed and probably also trimming down some of the armor in places in order to add a bit more to the gun decks, to the deck armor. I wonder if anyone's actually sketched that up. Probably Soli has. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Sorry if I mispronounced it horribly. Let's copy that. Galdar Ioni. If you're a very sneaky orc who managed to sneak into the World War II US Navy planning board, what's the greatest amount of DACA you can get built? To be honest, there's not a tremendous amount more that I could do in the World War II US planning board. There's a few delays you could circumvent and shortcut, but to be honest, when you look at the US building program, the Alaskas, as I mentioned before, were deferred in part because they just didn't have enough steel to go around for all the stuff that they were trying to build. So unless you're going to start putting off things like transport ships, etc., you're pretty much actually capped out for warship construction. In theory, you might use some advanced knowledge of the fact you won't actually need Overlord to curtail the production of transports and landing craft, etc., etc., once D-Day is successfully concluded, and argue that you can throw all of those resources into capital ship construction, but that's probably about of the closest that you're going to be able to get to increasing the amount of DACA in the US ships. Daniel Silverthorne says, does Mrs. Drack participate in many of your hobbies and interests? For example, does she take interest in medieval reenactment, gaming, naval history, and other interests of yours? I think we had this question in either the last live or the live before that. But yes, the short version is yes, she does. She goes with me to medieval reenactment. She takes part in the medieval reenactment. She knows my educational talks on longbows and medieval archery pretty much as well as I do now, albeit that, to be honest, she's heard me go over them so many times she probably can recite them in her sleep. Gaming wise, yes, she does play a fair number of games, albeit actually we have a few games that we do play together. So for example, we currently have a joint Ark Survival Evolved private server going, which we quite enjoy because we like collecting dinosaurs. And it's actually a fairly challenging game, so it's useful to have some backup. We've played Conan Online together before, but and we played World of Warships and World of Tanks before as well. But there are some differences there. For example, I like playing things like Mass Effect, the Mass Effect series, Dragon Age series. Whereas I don't particularly get along with Warframe and things like that, but she really does like playing Warframe. In fact, let me just open up my Steam library. What stuff so going through what I've currently got listed as my favourites. Age of Empires, I play that, she doesn't. Ark, we both play. Battlefleet, Gothic Armada, and Armada 2, I play that. Dishonored and Dishonored 2, we both play that. I really, really like that series. And so does Mrs. Drack. Homeworld Remastered, that's my precious. What else we've got? Plague Inc., yes, we both like destroying the world. Planet Zoo, yes, we both play that. Star Trek Online, I think she played that for a little bit, but that's mostly mine. Star Wars Squadrons, I need to start. Team Fortress 2, yes, we played so much Team Fortress 2 together. Oh dear. Total War, that Rome and Warhammer that's me, definitely. Worms Army, again, we played together. XCOM and XCOM 2 and XCOM, etc., etc., and so forth. Yes, we've both played that a lot. There's Dragon Age, Conan Exiles. Jedi Fallen Order, I think only I've played that. and the Dawn of War series. What's the rest of it? Naval history. Yes, she's into naval history, although obviously not as much as me.
Be difficult.
Yes, as she points out, it would be a little bit difficult for that to be into it as much as I am. Other interests, yes. Well, for example, we spent part of this afternoon going through the airsoft collection and working out which bits of our airsoft collection we were each going to use in the game that we're going to tomorrow. So in, what's the time? It's 9:30. So in 9 hours, we're going to get up, throw a possibly unhealthy number of airsoft guns into the car, and go and play in what is probably going to be a good example of what if the Somme with automatic weapons down in Faversham at Imperium Airsoft. So yes, we definitely share that interest. And of course, Mrs. Drack grew up in a culture where access to firearms was somewhat more prevalent than it is in the UK. So she can be quite scary sometimes, although she's not quite as given to the Leroy Jenkins style of play that I sometimes do. If you ever see me somewhere at an airsoft game, at some point during the day, I will get fed up, pick up a pair of high cycle MP5s or P90s and just go charging in dual wielding. Probably get shot repeatedly, but that's half the fun. DKLMN1. Don't know if you answered this or not, but who would win, Centre Force or the Italian fleet at Taranto if they had good shells? If you transplanted the Italian fleet at Taranto and put them in place of Centre Force and gave them decent shells, they would almost certainly do a lot better. Oh, it's a matchup against each other. Centre Force versus the Italian fleet. Now that's an interesting one. 2 Littorios. Well, if the Littorios have good shells, I'd certainly give one of them a distinct advantage going after the Nagato. Would I give the Cavors an advantage over the Congos? Maybe. I mean, they've not got the world's most powerful guns, but it's not exactly like the Congos have the world's best armor either. The other Littorio has to go up against Yamato, and I'm sorry, but that is not going to be a fair fight. So it's basically going to come down to, I think, can whichever Littorio faces off with its accurate shells against Nagato, can it finish Nagato quickly enough to come and help the one that's going to be being horribly beaten up by Yamato? Because those 15-inch shells pack a heck of a punch if they actually hit something. The rest of it, cruisers and destroyers, is much of a muchness. There's not quite as many Italian cruisers and destroyers in Taranto on the night of Taranto as there are in Centre Force, as far as I can recall. But to be honest, a lot of it is going to make or break around the battleship combat, because if one side finishes off the other side's battleships, then those battleships are going to weigh in on the cruiser fight, which pretty much will decide it one way or the other, even if the other side has the advantage already. Yes, aluminium fence, you are correct. Right, people are asking what is airsoft. No, so airsoft is not paintball. Paintball basically involves trying to fight with Napoleonic tactics, because your paintball gun has an accurate range of about 10 feet. And if you engage much beyond that, you get the wonderful prospect of, dumping an entire expensive magazine of paintballs downrange, only to watch them fly off in every single possible direction except the one that you're actually aiming at. And also, paintballs hurt a lot when they hit, especially on a cold day. Whereas, okay, 6mm plastic BBs will sting, and they can hurt a lot, but it's a lot less common. Basically, you can walk off most hits in airsoft as long as you've got the proper face protection. Yeah, you will lose an eye if you don't have face protection. Can lose a tooth if you don't have mouth protection. So they do take the safety gear fairly seriously when it comes to that kind of thing. But, as long as you've got good head protection, you might come out of an airsoft game with some pretty nasty welts, but that's it. You're going to wake up in the morning and the biggest pain you're likely to experience is the pain of overstretched muscles because you haven't been doing anything for very long. And airsoft is a lot more realistic. I mean, the 95% of paintball markers look like an interesting collection of pipe work with a massive great hopper on top and a CO2 tank strapped to the back, whereas airsoft weapons are realistic enough that in the UK you actually have to have a legal defence to own them, because unless you look absolutely close up and personal, they're very often impossible to distinguish from the real thing. Maybe at some point I should do a video on a day. I could do a fun Friday on a day at the airsoft game, but I'd have to talk to Imperium to make sure they're happy with me doing that first. Anyway, back on topic. Joshua S., when you finally visit the US, will you visit the USS North Carolina? Yes, absolutely. So, for those of you who aren't aware, now that the US is talking about reopening travel to foreign visitors from November, I think, and I know I've said this before, so I hope I'm not jinxing it, but I think my US trip is back on. Looking at late March, early April, sort of kind of around Easter time. Probably not the Easter holidays themselves, because that's going to be packed and rammed, and I don't need to worry about bank holidays anymore as much as before. But somewhere around about that time is my planned US trip. And I'm definitely visiting North Carolina amongst other places, assuming they'll let me on board, of course. So, yeah, that I'm definitely looking forward to that. The only reason I'm not planning things right now is that although the US government has said they're dropping travel restrictions in November, given the last couple of years, I'm going to wait before I put any money down on, plane tickets and visa applications and such. I'm going to wait till they actually open the country up. Brandon Schirmer, I have never seen a transparent airsoft gun. All of mine are... Put it this way, mine are realistic enough. I'm not going to show them on this live stream because YouTube would probably demonetize me. Although SNK have recently released a spring action airsoft Lee Enfield, so you can guess what's on my purchase list in the next few weeks when they get back to me. Nihil Patel, are you going to need to wait on trip 2 or 3 to see Texas? It depends. Texas, I believe, is moving to a dry dock at the end of this year. So I will then have to liaise with the guys who run Texas and ask if I can go and visit it in dry dock. If I can, that would be absolutely fantastic. But, I understand if the people running the dry dock don't want me wandering around there. A Human, do your airsoft buddies know about your channel? Yeah, a few of them do. A few of the staff do as well. In fact, one of them, I think, actually asked in the last Drydock Live whether or not I was going to the next event. Paulus Plain asks, in Lex Fridman podcast number 201, he and his guest talk about what if Earth was in a gas cloud with no stars visible from Earth? How could you navigate at sea? Nice looking sextant. Thank you very much. Someone actually sent me this fully working sextant. I've been having fun with that. Didn't blind myself getting the sun straight into my eyes because, of course, it's the UK, which means the last few days have just been massively overcast and raining. But there you go. Anyway, if Earth was in a gas cloud with no stars visible from Earth, how could you navigate at sea? Presumably you'd still be able to see the sun, so you could at least do that. The sun would allow you... Let's see, the sun actually technically allows you latitude and longitude, because you can measure the height of the sun above the horizon to get your latitude, and then you just have to work out, you have to wait until reliable enough clocks are invented to get your longitude, but you can actually do both. It's just that as compared to, using sextants or using, what they're called. The successor to the astrolabe is... It's the something staff. For the life, I can't remember what it is straight off the top of my head. Sighting staff or something like that. But yeah, basically, anyway, the point is if you can't see the stars, then you're limited to the sun and maybe the moon, which means you can only fix your position at certain times of day, whereas with the stars present, at least at night, you can obviously do a lot more fixing at a lot more different times. But it just because you can't see the stars doesn't preclude you being able to navigate. It just means you only have sort of once every 24 hours you can accurately fix your location, which, if you're heading for a coastline, may pose some problems. Tevildo Jacob stuff. Yeah, it may well have been that. I've forgotten it. Whip staff, possibly. Anyway, I'm sure I'll probably remember at some point along the lines, but Charles Henderson asks, how much was Kaiser Wilhelm responsible for the formation of the High Seas Fleet? If his father had lived, would there have been a High Seas Fleet? There would have been a High Seas Fleet, it just wouldn't have been anywhere near as big. Wilhelm II was very much responsible for the formation of the High Seas Fleet. It was a combination of, he bought into Tirpitz's idea about how... Well, fundamentally, he wanted Germany to take its place, as he saw it, at the seat of the great powers. To do that, he needed an empire, but the people with the biggest empires were not so keen on letting other people in on that particular game, and could use their fleets to enforce it. And he decided that for Germany to be a truly great nation, it needed an empire. To have that empire, it needed to be able to exert its will where it wanted, and to exert its will where it wanted, it needed to be able to make the biggest navy on the planet, i.e. the Royal Navy, back off. And so he bought into Tirpitz's risk fleet theory. Also, before he became Kaiser, he was just a teensy-weensy bit obsessed with the Royal Navy, and desperately wanted his own to be, if not bigger, then at least better. And yeah, a combination of national interest and a little bit of envy very much meant that he was a major driving force behind the High Seas Fleet, as we understand it, being formed. If his father had lived, yeah, there would have been a High Seas Fleet. I think the German Navy definitely would have grown beyond being a coastal defence force, but it wouldn't have tried to challenge Britain, I think. They probably would have looked at a force capable of either challenging France or risk fleeting France, but without Wilhelm II particularly, there's not really much incentive with his father to try and challenge the Royal Navy. Jeff318 asks, A railway-related question. Whose designs do you prefer more, Stania or Gresley, and why? And if neither, who and why? Oh, I do like a large Grizzly engine, to be honest, but I think it comes down to size. Because if you want the really big engines, at least as far as the UK is concerned, then Grizzly all the way. But if you're looking at the smaller sizes of engines and the mid-size passenger locomotives, then especially ones on the LMS line, which I've said before, I really like LMS, then the Stanias would be the ones that I'd have to go for. There's just something purposeful and compact about them, but I think they operate, fortunately, on slightly different levels in terms of size, generally at least. I mean, okay, yes, you've got things like the Coronation class, which they compete on the field with things like Mallard and everything. But I'd say if you're looking at the big stuff, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to go with Mallard. The mid-size heavy passenger units, though, I'll go with Stania. That is one heck of a combination of numbers and letters. Therefore, I'm pretty sure you know who you are. But anyway, that person asks, was Prince of Wales sunk more due to underestimation of air power or underestimation of the Japanese in general? A combination of both. I know that sounds a bit trite, but if I had to go for one, I'd probably say just about edging the underestimation of the Japanese rather than air power itself. The British were fairly au fait with how dangerous air power could be by the end of 1941, thanks to their experiences in the Mediterranean. And yes, mistakes were made. You know, you wouldn't send Prince of Wales and Repulse out like they were in the Mediterranean. So that does suggest definitely that it was an element of underestimating the Japanese. But I think it was as much an underestimation of Japanese technology as much as the Japanese themselves. Yes, there may well have been something of a racial element going, but at the same time, the sheer range at which the Japanese launched those torpedo attacks, that was a technological level that no one was really expecting. So yeah, underestimating the Japanese in general, I think, would probably be just about like 60-40 would be my bet at that point. Hang on a second. Sorry, Mrs. Drac is going to come and make sure the screen doesn't turn itself off in the background, although you won't see her because, of course, the camera is here and my screen is another 4 foot further back. And she can sneak between the gap. Thank you very much. Whiskey Delta Golf. Did the other Washington signatories object to the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, and why was it down to Britain to give Germany the green light to rearm? Depends on the signatory. France was immensely irritated. The Italians were a little bit annoyed, but more because France would start building to match the Germans, which meant they then had to build to match the French and so on and so forth. So, whereas before, France and Italy had kind of had an understanding that neither of them would spend hilarious amounts of money on rearming their fleets. The Americans were a little bit ticked off, but to be perfectly honest, it was for the Americans and Japanese, it was far less of a concern than it was for the French and the Italians. You can argue. The thing is, technically speaking, the Washington Treaty doesn't really give anybody much of a leg to stand on to complain about the Anglo-German Naval Treaty. Because the Germans hadn't been party to the Washington Naval Treaty or the London Naval Treaty. So it wasn't like two powers involved in the treaty negotiating a separate agreement that I guess my phone's do not disturb has worn off, behind other people's backs. So there is that element involved. But the people who had legitimate reason to be annoyed by what was effectively a unilateral changing of treaty terms were the people who signed the Versailles treaties, which just so happened to be pretty much the same people who'd signed the Washington naval treaties. So, yes, the Washington signatories did have reason to object, and say some of them did quite strenuously, to Britain unilaterally allowing Germany to rearm, but not because they signed the Washington Treaty, more so because they'd signed the Versailles Treaty, which didn't include a clause that said Britain could unilaterally give things to Germany that were restricted. Hey, human, how did you meet Mrs. Drac? I've said before, we met and she pulled a knife on me. And that will remain the mystery. And no, it wasn't dodgy. I wasn't trying anything dodgy. But it is quite funny, the no context. Yeah, we met, and the first thing future Mrs. Drac did was pull out a knife. For those of you who were lucky enough to run into me at Tankfest, you will have some idea of who Mrs. Drac is, and who knows, at some point, at some event, someone might run into her and actually ask her exactly what the circumstances were, and I'm sure she'll be very pleased to tell you. It was all friendly and in good humour, though. Quinn the Q. Pre-World War II, were there any high-level naval officers that did or would have defected and helped the other side knowing the war was coming? Not high-level defections that I'm aware of. The French was, well, unless you count, things like various navies skedaddling out of their countries before the Germans took over and fighting against the Germans, and sometimes the puppet governments the Germans set up. Technically, I suppose that's a defection. The French, well, the Vichy French were seriously worried about some of their senior officers defecting to the Free French in the aftermath of the collapse of France, especially Richelieu's captain and his command staff. They were so worried that he was going to just take Richelieu off and join the Allies, they actually replaced him, even though he wasn't anywhere near metropolitan France at the time. But yeah, I don't think there were any major high-ranking defections pre-World War II. Animal 16365, Gangut versus Wyoming, who would win? Oh. If we're talking pre-World War I, it's a very close thing, but assuming the crews are equal, I'd actually fractionally put my money on the Ganguts, purely because their guns hit harder and are actually pretty darn accurate, which means that there are more circumstances in which a hit that a Gangut inflicts on a Wyoming might punch through armor and do something nasty, as compared to the Wyoming shells in certain circumstances won't do that. Also, the Wyomings did have some issues initially with accuracy from their midships guns. Almost all of the US turret farm 12-inch dreadnoughts did, because the midships magazines had to be insulated and cooled to try and keep the shell and propellant temperatures down, because they're surrounded by the machinery. It didn't really work a lot of the time, which led to those middle guns having slightly different firing characteristics, which somewhat threw the fall of shot spotting off. The Ganguts didn't have quite as much trouble in that respect, so it's a very close fight, but I'd say 55-45 or 60-40, I'd just about hand it to the Ganguts. Again, assuming crew, etc., and those other soft factors are about the same. Maxwell Looney, fully functional Oklahoma and Nevada are teleported through time and space and parked to the northwest of Dunkirk during the Channel Dash. Can they sink both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and survive? One-on-one, theoretically. In terms of the actual Channel Dash, probably not, because there's Prince Eugen and air cover and shore batteries and destroyers and torpedo boats, etc., all with them. So, yeah, one-on-one, yeah, fine. Nevada and Oklahoma have got the firepower and the armour to slug it out with the Scharnhorsts. But with a whole Channel Dash force coming up, I think the entire Channel Dash force probably has the advantage over the American ships. Jones 1, have you visited various German naval museums, or if not, do you have any plans to do so? I haven't yet. I do have plans to do so. Apart from anything, I want to go and see the craziness that is the U-boat in Munich. The place that's possibly the single furthest point from the sea that you can get whilst being on the European continent, and then they put a U-boat there. Then again, the Americans put a U-boat in Chicago. I don't know what it is with people with U-boats and sticking them as far from the sea as is humanly possible. Do you think they're going to just, like, grow legs and go back? Sherman 117, if Prince of Wales and Repulse were not sunk and the British sent them to join ABDA Command, how would the Battle of the Java Sea go? Very differently. I mean, if it's the Battle of the Java Sea plus Prince of Wales and Repulse, then it's going to be a fairly one-sided affair for ABDA Command, because those ships can blow the Japanese cruisers out of the water comfortably beyond any realistic range of them being able to do all that much back, and beyond most ranges that the Long Lance can achieve. Because remember, it's not about linear range, which it pretty much is with guns. It's the deflection range, and the deflection range that the ranges that the battleships can engage is probably a bit beyond the Long Lance's capability. But you have to bear in mind, if Prince of Wales and Repulse do survive, then the Japanese are going to be sending some somewhat heavier forces into the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, whether that's battleships or Congos, kind of a coin toss. But realistically speaking, that kind of thing would provoke a heavier Japanese response, which, of course, it spirals into the unknowns. Vintage car history. Amphibious cars have been tried since 1905. Has anyone tried to build an amphibious ship? I'm presuming from that you mean a ship that can go onto land. They've certainly thought about it. And then you've got things like amphibious tanks and various amphibious assault vehicles. It is sometimes a bit difficult to work out where to draw the line with some of those things, because you've got things like the Duck, where it's basically a boat that happens to have wheels, but it spends most of its time on land. I suppose an amphibious ship, you'd have to draw the line maybe and say the difference between an amphibious ship and an amphibious vehicle is where it typically rests, i.e., even the most boat-like of assault vehicles and transport vehicles like Ducks, at the end of the day, that people park them on land, they don't tend to moor them at sea or at a quayside. So they would be vehicles or land vehicles rather than ships. In terms of amphibious ships, yeah. Technically, things like Greek triremes could just be picked up out of the water by their crews and sort of backpacked across things. There was a road, I think, in Corinth, where they hauled them up out of the water and along. So technically, a trireme counts as an amphibious ship if you're allowed to use the crew. But in terms of anything sort of substantial enough to be a ship proper as opposed to a boat, no, I'm not aware of any truly amphibious shipping. There are a few submarines that have wheels equipped so they can roll over the ocean floor more safely. but I don't know if... Yeah, I don't know if you'd count those as amphibious because they're still in the water. They're not leaving the water. Tyler Kuhn, to fulfill one of your fantasies, how would you design an anti-whaling ship using World War II ship design? The catch being it needs to be long range and you have to try and force them to surrender their ship first, and then you can sink it. Flower class corvette. Ironically enough, based on a whaling-fishing design. Flower class corvette, though, it's got the range for certain. Or one of the larger corvettes or sloops. Take that as a design basis. Slow speed, fine. Got a nice bit of range. Designed, as I say, taken from a whaling fishing design, so I can blend in as well. And just about heavily armed enough that when they realise I'm not another whaling ship, I can just roll up and say, yeah, shot across the bow, surrender first, otherwise you will be sleeping with the fishes instead of hunting them. And yes, I know, the whales are not fish, they're mammals, but come on, give me a break here. I'm trying to get some puns in there. Captain Jack 1138, are you planning on doing any videos about the Wix class destroyers? Yes, if I haven't done so already. I know I did the Clemsons. Have I done? Yeah, I've done the Clemson class. Haven't done the Wix class yet, though. So yeah, I'll do the Wix class at some point. They should be an interesting one. See, the Wix, to be honest though, the Wix class are... They're amongst they're amongst a group of certain ship classes and certain ships where I'm always in two minds. They obviously do need a 5-minute guide, as all classes of ships eventually will have, but they're also pivotal and interesting enough, and there's enough material about them. I'm also kind of tempted to do a Wednesday video on them as well. When it comes to those kind of things, I'm not entirely sure whether I should do maybe a half-hour Wednesday video on just something like the Wix class, or whether I should do sort of a 45-minute, hour-long video where I look at 2 or 3 classes in depth and detail that had similar impacts. Or so maybe a Wednesday special that's 45-50 minutes long that looks in a fair bit of detail at the Wix, Clemson and Fletcher classes, something like that. There's hope for change. Thank you very much. So, Quinn the Q. Would we still have an Iowa class in service if one of them had been refitted with nuclear power? Depends when. If the reactor... It depends when it was refitted. Because the thing is, the reactor on a surface ship, the reactor will eventually need refueling. So if the reactor was still going and still had a lot of life in it, I don't know if they'd still be in service now, but they might well have, say, if they'd been refitted with a reactor in the mid-80s, they might well have kept going for a fair bit longer until the reactor ran down and needed refueling. If they'd been refitted much earlier, then almost certainly not, because then it would have come to a point where it needed refueling in the 90s, and there's no way the US government, I think, would have paid for it at that point. Miles McCaskill, did the Nelson and Rodneys have small tube boilers, and if not, what would be your guess at their top speed if they did? Would it have been high enough to keep pace with Bismarck? I don't think they could be made to keep pace with Bismarck unless they... No, actually, no, not at all. Keep pace with Bismarck. Bismarck could hit just over 30 knots on a good day. They did have small tube boilers, but they had late 1910, early 1920s designed small tube boilers. By the mid to late 1930s, boiler technology had advanced quite considerably. So, whilst small tube boilers offered a lot more power density than large tube boilers, the small tube boilers of 1920 as compared to the small tube boilers of 1935 were two very different creatures. So, if they'd been refitted in the late 1930s with late 1930s era higher pressure boilers, then assuming they're done a like for like, they probably could easily have hit 25, 26 knots, I would imagine. Colin Cameron says we need an iron gravy to match the Pepsi one. Well, I'd agree. I mean, being bright orange isn't the downside it used to be. It's not exactly like camo actually means anything more than pretty decoration these days when it comes to warships at sea. Ninja X Alpaca asks, what would have had a higher chance of success? Sending reinforcements to the Philippines or the evacuation of Wake in 1942? The evacuation of Wake Island, because you could temporarily force local superiority and get that. Sending reinforcements to the Philippines is just an interesting way of losing a lot of troops, ships, and men. 2 seconds. Sorry about that. We're going for 3 hours, and my voice is beginning to go. I think I've been quite tired because of all the various bits and pieces I've been doing today. Aluminium fence, thoughts on Guinness. It's interesting to watch other people drink it. Cow to face. During World War I, a number of battle cruisers exploded by detonation. How often did things like this happen in the Age of Sail? Also, does Mrs. Drac like Iron Brew? Good question. Mrs. Drac. Mrs. Drac. Do you like Iron Brew?
It's alright.
She says it.
It tastes like actual iron.
There you go. She says it's all right. So our marriage is intact. Anyway, how often did magazine detonations happen in the Age of Sail? They weren't common, but they did happen. Not on I wouldn't say semi-frequently, but they weren't unknown. They generally didn't happen when ships were shot directly. The armor-piercing or wood-piercing capabilities of cannonballs getting all the way down into the magazines that just weren't there. Where magazines generally would go off would be if the ship had caught fire and the fire spread to the magazines. And when that happened, it was a very spectacular thing. Because bear in mind, yes, you've got cannon fire and everything, but for the vast majority of people, a gun firing, or maybe if they're sort of veteran sailors or soldiers, maybe the magazine of a fort going up might be the biggest explosion they've ever seen or witnessed. And the magazines in, say, the towers of forts and such, like, they might have a bit of explosive in them, but not massive amounts, generally speaking. 1 or 2 spectacular exceptions. Whereas a ship of the line would be carrying double-digit tons of gunpowder. And when that goes off, you are really going to know about it. And if you're not in any way, shape, or form used to either experiencing or even the concept of an explosion that big, that's going to be one heck of a shock to the system. I mean, at the Battle of the Nile, when Lorient exploded, the whole battle stopped for several minutes. In part because everybody was trying to make sure they hadn't been set on fire by the explosion, but in part also because everyone, British and French, was just looking at it going, oh, wow, that is not good. This basically stunned an entire battle into silence. Which, to be fair, if you're right up close next to it, you can kind of understand. If at some point you Google Richard Hammond gunpowder plot, yes, one of the former Top Gear presenters, he did a special years ago now where they recreated the Guy Fawkes plot. They constructed a replica of the old Houses of Parliament. They somehow, in this country, got permission for a ton, literal metric ton of gunpowder to be shipped in, and set it off. And when you see the damage and the amount of, like, the sheer power that 1 ton of gunpowder does, yeah, now try, like, 30 or more tons of gunpowder. Yeah, it's it would be quite the spectacular thing. Hello, military aviation history. Fancy seeing you here. Nosdomu89 asks, I was watching Das Boot recently and noticed the boat had encountered a solitary destroyer, wandering around at one point. Were these kinds of one-on-one or two-on-one encounters common? Not common, but they could happen. So obviously, convoy duty, where there's one, there's more. But at choke points like Gibraltar or the Channel, places like that, it was entirely possible for a destroyer or two, or a frigate or corvette or whatever, or two, to come across a U-boat or vice versa. Usually they'd be part of a larger patrol or hunting group, but fairly spread out. But yeah, in the right circumstances, kind of a solo or 2v1 engagement was quite possible. Right. Right. There we go. Okay, let's move that. Ah, yes, there's... Okay, so... I think I've got everything there. Right, so the only one that remains now is Smiling Nid's question. He says, from a selection of his preferred World of Warships paper ships, please give a hypothetical service life, assuming they do at least one interesting thing. Do as many as you have material or time for. Well, it's 10 past, so I'll give it 5 minutes. So we're going to look at a quick 5-minute trip through possible interesting life stories of otherwise paper ships. So let's have a quick look. What have we got? Okay, some of these are not going to be that interesting because of their circumstances. So, for example, French battleship Champagne or Champagne, no, whatever. Champagne or Champagne? I don't know. Anyway, that one. It's a big French battleship. It's almost certainly going to end up in a similar situation to Jean Bart, or possibly even Clemenceau. So not actually completed. Not going to do an awful lot. Same thing with the German carrier Rhine. Even if it is completed, it's not really going to be in a time of any particular use. Hakuryu, however, the Tier 10 Japanese carrier, basically the Japanese equivalent of a Midway, that was planned. Hypothetically could have been laid down sooner. Let's say if they'd chosen well, it wasn't called Hakuryu, they're in the Circle 5 and Circle 6 programs, but the equivalent, if they decided to lay it down and say instead of Shinano, push Shinano back a year or two, then you're probably looking at entering service just around about the same time, maybe just after Taiho. So at the last gasp of the Japanese Navy, when it had enough aircraft and pilots to actually put up a meaningful level of attack. So she probably would have had her deployment at something like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where her size and the number of aircraft she could deploy would probably come as a rather interesting surprise. John Driscoll's Guy Fawkes Stay Still celebrated with bonfires, yes, and fireworks. But then after the Battle of Philippine Sea, Hakuryu is probably just going to end up, like the rest of the Japanese carrier force, under-equipped, and probably ending up as a decoy as part of the northern force of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Whether or not she gets sunk, That's neither here nor there. She'd probably attract a lot of fire, but given that she'd be the biggest target at present. The UK heavy cruiser Surrey, that's obviously going to be the next heavy cruiser in line in what the British were planning to build. So again, let's assume, for sake of argument, that she's laid down in 38 or 39 instead of they're not proceeding with her. So she's going to be complete in late 41, early 42 if they really put their pedal to the metal. So what's she going to do? 41, 42, single powerful heavy cruiser. She's probably going to end up deployed to the Mediterranean at that point. It would be a coin toss between sticking her on Denmark Strait Patrol duty, but they've got enough counties to do that. Whereas down in the Mediterranean, they're really, really hurting for heavier cruisers. They're making do with a scratch force of Arethuses, Leanders, the occasional town, and a bunch of Didos, right, especially after the loss of York. So she'd probably go into the Mediterranean, fight the Italians a few times, probably then end up in taking part in Torch, Husky, and then probably being deployed as a cruiser squadron flagship out to the Far East. Russian battleship Sinop, well, that's going to be a very short affair, bombed by the Luftwaffe circa 1941, and that's all she wrote. Commonwealth battleship Yukon. Now that's an interesting one, because of course that is based on what the would be quite helpfully called by Little White Mouse, the great and historical monarch. So if you've got a Yukon rolling around, so a 15-inch armed King George V type built in the mid to late 1930s, now that is really going to have an interesting career, because that she's almost certainly going to be around for the Battle of Denmark Strait. So Yukon quite possibly takes the place of Hood at the Battle of Denmark Strait. So it could be Yukon and Prince of Wales duking it out with Bismarck and Prince Eugen, which could go very differently, obviously, because Yukon's going to be much better protected. And is going to have modern fire control equipment. So potentially the Battle of Denmark Strait might mark the end of Bismarck's voyage there and then, if Yukon exists and is in service. Yeah, I think, well, that's 22:16, so that's given it 5-6 minutes. I hope you're happy with that particular little set of summaries. Rightio, let's see what's going on. Couple of messages. Right. Let's save that, because there's a couple of questions I need to come back to at a later date. Let's expand that. Ryan Gale asks, does anyone remember from the Franklin video what the effect Drac talked about was called, when it's basically a wave going through the ship's hull from an explosion that caused a lot of casualties? Yeah, there were a couple of things that went on there, but it was basically a transmitted shock. There was a transmitted shock wave and there was a reflected shock wave. The transmitted shock wave whipped through the hull and did in quite a number of people who were slightly deeper in the ship. The reflected shockwave, though, was an absolute killer, because with the height of the hangars, if you are ever on board an Essex-class carrier, especially one that's closer to its World War II fit than some, or you look at photos of the interior of a hangar of an Essex-class carrier, a lot of things like pilots' briefing rooms and such like were in what's effectively a lightweight metal box that was attached to either the side or the top of the hangar to make use of some of the space. And when you got some of the major explosions aboard Franklin that confined inside the hangar or happening on the flight deck and projecting down into the hangar, the armoured deck of an Essex class, and indeed most US aircraft carriers, purpose-built carriers, was the hangar deck as opposed to the flight deck. And what happened is the explosion went down, obviously confined to a certain degree by the size of the ship. It hit the hangar deck. It couldn't burst through the hangar deck, and so instead it reflects back up, except that if you're now in one of these box rooms, if you like, you've got this still got explosive shockwaves coming at you horizontally and from above from various things going off, but you now got this shockwave that's hit the deck and is now rebounded up underneath you, and there's nowhere for it to go, because obviously if that box room is still there, then the flight deck is technically still there also. So you get this rebound effect, which it's absolutely horrific. The shockwave alone, where it was transmitted straight into people who were in direct contact with bulkheads and frames and things that were stiff enough to directly transmit the shock to them, were just killed instantly. Other people were thrown up off what for them was the floor, hard enough to just smash into the ceiling, and probably pretty much killed instantly as well. You had to be incredibly lucky to survive that. Explosions in confined spaces can do all sorts of horrible things. I mean, it's one of the reasons why major magazine explosions on things like battle cruisers don't have that many survivors. It's not just the people dying there. It's that this is an explosion that's confined within the ship, and so there's a transmitted shockwave that goes through the ship, pretty much killing anybody who's inside for the most part. Which is why you tend to find A, not many survivors, and B, the ones who do survive tend not to be inside the hull of the ship. They're either in the superstructure or out on the decks. Because, you can have a magazine go off in the stern of your ship, but if you're deep down in the bow, the shockwave that gets transmitted through the ship by an explosion of that power may very well just kill you where you stand. Grey Ghost, Tankfest did not interview me. No. I saw a few of them, but I saw a few staff and everything, but no. I saw Lindy Beige. He was out and about doing some filming. That was quite fun. So I saw him. I met Rita. And apparently Jingles was around, but for the first time I had a lot of Tankfest, I didn't actually figure out where he was. Oh, yeah, yes. Military Aviation History Art says, or Chris says, tell everyone about the book. There's only 35 hours left. Yes. To answer Aluminium Fence, no, I'm not writing a book with Chris. That's Chris and Bernard's book, so Military Aviation History and Military History Visualized. They're writing a book on the bane of many a Royal Navy warship, the Ju-87 Stuka. Well, in fact, I think they've written the book, because otherwise they wouldn't be crowdfunding it, nonetheless. They are crowdfunding it. I think it's stukabook.com. Well, I've backed it, so if you want to read about the Ju-87 Stuka in extreme detail, I would definitely recommend going for it. As I say, bane of the existence of so many ships in the Mediterranean, North Sea, English Channel, etc., etc., etc. Occasional bane of my great uncle's existence over in the deserts of North Africa in World War II as well, albeit he came off the better out of that particular encounter. So yeah, whether you want to take Chris's view that the Stuka is the platform and the ship is the mobile target, or you want to take the more naval approach of the Stuka is the annoying buzz, and for which we need to develop a lot of interesting fire control systems, well, pay your money and take your choice. Cow Two Face, is it a card game behind you, Naval Supremacy? No, that is a Duke Cannon bar of soap. Apparently it carries the scent of naval supremacy. Therefore, of course, I had to have one, or possibly four. So yes, when I go to Airsoft tomorrow, I shall smell of naval supremacy. I'm not entirely sure what that means, or if it's going to have any benefit for me. but it will be a thing. Grey Ghost, USS Grey Ghost, have any World War II ships survived a magazine explosion and got repaired? Yes, a few. USS Boise, for one. It's basically a bit of pot luck when a magazine explosion goes off, whether or not you survive. Boise and a couple of other ships, including at least one other US cruiser that I recall, they got lucky in that the magazine hit they took involved a shell punching through into the magazine below the waterline, which you might think is, not good, because that means the primary defense of the ship has failed rather spectacularly. However, as it turns out, if you punch a socking great hole through the side of the ship, the water tends to like coming in very quickly. So although the magazine caught fire, and the pressure began to build up, within moments the fire was also being smothered by dozens of tons of seawater. So although it was damaged by the explosion, it wasn't the catastrophic ship is now in half problem that other ships had. Whereas other ships that had magazine explosions where a shell came in such a way that either flooding couldn't reach it, or it was set off by another explosion from somewhere else, or it was set off by a projectile, whether it be a bomb or a shell that came in above the waterline, therefore there wasn't anything to immediately damp down the fires, and pop goes the ship. Ryan Gale says, is Lindy Page as goofy in real life as he seems in his videos? Well, I only got to say hi, literally just say hi to him a couple of times, because one, he was filming, so didn't want to interrupt that. It would be a bit rude. And the other is that, well, I don't know. I don't know, maybe he was just having a bad moment or whatever, but the first time I saw him, he was filming, and then when he put the camera down, I thought, oh my goodness, the poor guy looks like he's been through an actual war. Maybe he was just feeling a bit harassed and frazzled, but I just wanted, I sort of looked and thought, do I try and engage, just apart from just saying hi? And then I thought, to be honest, if I looked that harassed at that point, I would want people to leave me alone, so I just left it as at a hello and let him get on with his day, because the last thing you need when you're stressed out is people delaying you from doing stuff. He looked a bit happier towards the end of the day, though, when I saw him a second time, so that was good. Dark Angel's Horn says, Jingles was not at Tankfest this year, he was pet sitting. Maybe my sources were wrong. Someone else said they saw him, but who knows. James Bentley, could the Germans have benefited from light aircraft carriers to protect their battleships from the Royal Navy? Not really. A light aircraft carrier doesn't offer anything that the Luftwaffe can't, except possibly some slightly better cooperation when it comes to defending ships close to home. The only potential avenue where a light carrier can offer a defense that the Luftwaffe cannot offer is when the battleships are out at sea. But if they're out at sea, then the Royal Navy can come after them with fleet carriers. And, a light aircraft carrier carrying 2 dozen aircraft versus a fleet carrier carrying 3-4 dozen aircraft or more, especially if it's one of the American ones, the fleet carrier can put up a lot more fighters as escort and just suppress the light aircraft carriers stuff. So it might technically help. If the British aren't expecting a light aircraft carrier, then they might just send in Swordfish. They might get mobbed by fighters and brought down, but that's kind of a thing that's only going to happen once, and you're now risking 2 ships out at sea, which are probably going to get quite badly damaged or sunk. one way or the other. Plus, also, most light aircraft carriers, Independence class aside, generally don't tend to be quick enough to keep up with a fast battleship. Marcus Z, or Z, I guess. World War I, 1917 versus... 1917 Austrian fleet versus Italian fleet, Austro-Hungarian fleet, versus Italian fleet. Who would have won? That's a good question. Leonardo, well, it depends. I think at that point Leonardo da Vinci's exploded. So, 4 Tegethoffs versus Cavour, Dante Alighieri. I don't know. The Italians have lost a bunch of their armoured cruisers. It'd be an interesting one. I know people like to slate the Tegethoffs, but you know, a lot of the issues that people pick up on are reported in 1 or 2 ships during the Ancona attacks, and then not reported again. Now, admittedly, Svent Esteban could stand to have been built slightly better, but it's not exactly like the Italians were short on issues themselves. I mean, 1917, the Italian fleet practically is going to win because it can summon the French and British ships that are in the area to help it. But if it's a direct one-on-one kind of Knights Honour confrontation, I think I'd actually have a very hard time calling the shots at that point. Right, let's keep going. Crimson Call, was there any way to rebuild the Königsbergs or Nürnbergs to make them ocean-going or convert them to CVs? They're too small to make anything other than very weird, very low-capacity escort carriers. As far as making them ocean-going, fundamentally, they're too small, they're too slight, they're too lightly built. Yes, in theory, you might be able to make them ocean-going, but it would involve pretty much an entire rebuild to the point that to rebuild them and properly proof them against, you know, warping the hulls out of all proportion for sea service, you might as well just build new ships. Maybe a revised design. Brady L asks, had Rear Admiral Crutchley remained on station with HMS Australia during the First Battle of Savo Island, is the outcome more likely to change or remain very similar to the historical outcome? It depends. It depends a lot on how much warning they get. Yeah, that's a pretty good one, actually. I mean, having another set of watchers out there is definitely going to help. Whether or not they spot the Japanese in time, who knows? But given how fast Canberra got into action and almost managed to get into action, if Australia and Canberra get the same level of warning, the Japanese focusing on taking out Canberra, Australia will get into action and was pretty good at it, by all accounts. So it won't go exactly the same. I think Australia will put up a fight. Can she win on her own? Especially if Chicago goes wandering off in doing its own thing and Canberra's out of action pretty fast. No, she's not going to win a fight against Mikawa's entire force, but she can dump torps in the water, she can get firing with her main armament, possibly even her secondaries. She can do a fair bit of damage to a lot of Mikawa's cruisers, which are not the world's best protected, which, A, mauls Mikawa's force a little bit, especially if 1 or 2 of the torpedoes get lucky, and B, serves to either indirectly alert and buy time for the next force of cruisers, or possibly Crutchley might even get a legitimate signal out telling them to get ready to fight, if nothing else. So whilst Australia might end up in the similar state to Canberra, she will almost certainly do a fair bit of damage and alert the northern forces, at which point, when Macau's now damaged forces head north, instead of having the 3 New Orleans basically having to have officers argue with other officers and men as to whether or not they should even be preparing for action, they'll be closed up and ready for action, which in turn will probably do more damage to Macau's forces. At which point it might turn into a score draw. It might even turn into an Allied victory. It might still be a narrow Japanese victory, but it's certainly going to be a lot harder for them. Yeah, Chris is mentioning he can relate to Lindy Page. I can imagine. Yeah. Aluminium fence, how would you stop wheels on a sub from making noise? Basically, you don't put it on combat subs. I think the US sub that I'm thinking about that has wheels was an exploration sub, and I think there's a Russian mini sub these days. I think it's the Lasharik that has wheels, but it's designed for intel work on the seabed, not combat. Animal16365 says, when you play Airsoft tomorrow, you need to call in naval gunfire support. Funnily enough, we are actually on the coast, so if there was stuff available, it would be in range. Real MCB, how feasible are carriers in a surface raiding role if they don't have to stop and search? Potentially quite. It depends on how many escort forces your opponent has. So if your enemy has a lot of fast cruisers available, and they can act in a more freewheeling role, then it's not a good idea at all, because it's a very easy way to lose a carrier, and similarly for fast capital ships. But if your enemy's escort forces either don't include a lot of fast cruisers, or you can tie those cruisers down to having to escort the convoys themselves, i.e. and the majority of the escorts are slower sloops, corvettes, destroyer escorts, etc., then carriers can, in theory, actually be a fairly powerful surface raiding force, because they've got the speed to then evade most things, as say if you can confine the enemy fast units down, and you can use your aircraft to find the convoy, so it makes life a lot easier, and then you can attack the convoy remotely from the air without actually risking your ship, and most convoy escorts aren't massively heavily set up for anti-aircraft work for a lot of the time. So, yeah, that it's possible, but the thing is, you wouldn't want to use a fleet carrier for it if you had other jobs for your fleet carrier. Something like an Independence class, in terms of size, performance, speed, would be kind of your ideal surface raiding carrier, if the circumstances allow. See you later, Chris. Chris has gone off to bed. Probably a good idea. I mean, I'm closing in on times on time myself, I think. Right. Grey Ghost, no, I don't actually have an airsoft minigun or an airsoft shotgun. It's all snipers, sniper rifles, submachine guns, machine pistols, rifles, regular pistols, that kind of thing. Right. Oh, well. Yeah, I can feel my voice going as well, so I'm going to have to call it pretty soon. Knight 6831 with a short Shetland and short Seaford have made good maritime patrol aircraft. Yeah, they're big, fast flying boats. They would have made very good maritime patrol aircraft. The Sunderland did very well in that role, and that's kind of the predecessor. Dark Angels Fallen, what is your favourite sci-fi battleship? Probably the Flame Wrought, because it's the flagship of my favourite 40k-30k Space Marine chapter Legion the Salamanders, and I also got a custom-made Battlefleet Gothic scale Flame Wrought made for me by a very talented 3D modeller, who then got it 3D printed for me. So it's the centrepiece of my little Salamanders fleet, if I ever find somebody else in the local area who plays Battlefleet Gothic. Okay, I'm going to do 3-ish more questions, and then I'm going to call it there, because A, I need sleep, and B, I can really feel my voice is on the edge. So, Marcus Z, if the High Seas Fleet hadn't scuttled, would Britain or the US have sold some of the ships to countries like South America with their dreadnought race ongoing, or scrapped them? Mostly scrapped them. They might try to make a few quid out of selling on a few to certain countries like trusted allies and such. But certainly the bigger, scarier ones like Hindenburg and Baden, they would have retained for testing and scrapping. Some of the less capable ones, sort of the mid-range ones, they might have tried to hit a sweet spot to sell on to people. But it would have to very definitely be to third parties where that might be their only ships of that particular type, rather than selling it to, you know, any navy that they thought might actually matter to them in direct naval combat. Yeah, Rob, Luke, and normally I probably would go on for a little bit longer, but as I say, I've got to get up early tomorrow, and I've been working quite hard all day around the house, so I'm a little bit shattered. Okay, the last two questions. Packet of birdseed. If a convoy is carrying tanks and the convoy is attacked, would the tanks help defend? Not usually, because they're in the hold, which is not usually a place in which you can easily fire the guns. But there were cases where they did think about it. PQ-17, for example, one of the convoy ships that had tanks in the hold, went and disguised itself as an iceberg and ranged the tanks up on deck, waiting for a German raider to appear so they'd have something to fire back with. But typically, no. And F. Anderson UFO would like to see my presumably Battlefleet Gothic models. Yeah, I think when I did one of the first Dystopian Wars videos, there's another one of those coming up soon, actually, by the way. I've got a few box sets that I'm in the process of painting. I did show some of my cupboards of models and my massive piles of shame, but in my unpainted models. But yeah, maybe in Fan Friday or something, if people are interested in what other models I've built, etc., I can show some of those off. That might be an interesting thing to do. Okay, and then this will be the last one, I think. Jake Miller asks, what would you do with $10 billion? Rebuild Warspite, send a diving expedition to find a pair of binoculars thrown at Kamchatka, or buy a museum ship? With $10 billion? Yeah, sure, I'd rebuild Warspite for that. Probably wouldn't make a dent. Buy a museum ship? Maybe. It would have to depend on which one's around. What I would do, though, is absolute first thing I would do, it would be go out and find all the books that, like I've done with Russian and Soviet battleships, by the way, on sale at the USNI web shop with the code DRAC, giving you a discount off the price. Anyway, yeah, I would go out and find all the really good naval history books that are now out of print, and scalpers have run up into hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars worth of charges if you want a copy. And then I would make sure I buy one good quality copy of each one, find the people who have the publishing rights, as I've done with USNI, and pay for them to be republished at reasonable prices, and watch the scalpers scream and moan and cry into their cornflakes for the rest of time and laugh like a maniac. Then I would try and find various important bits of historical documentation, photographs, plans, etc., that might be in private collections, and offer people pretty good deals on purchasing them. And once I've got them, scan them, 3D print, or 3D scan them, or just scan them depending on whether they're a document or a photo, etc. Put them all up for public domain. And then I go and retire onto my apartment on Warspite and keep doing the channel live from my very own battleship. So, yeah, I hate scalpers. Can you tell? Anyway, I think that pretty much wraps us up for today. And so I'm just going to say thank you very much, everybody, for listening, watching, and I hope to see you again in another live stream. Obviously, the mid-month live stream will be, all things being equal, Saturday the 16th of October, and that will be questions taken directly from the chat from the start. So if you have missed having your question answered in this one, sorry, there's only a limited amount of time once all the Patreon questions are done, but you'll have a much better chance in 2 weeks' time. And I will see you again another time. Bye-bye.